Who are you? The voice came through the phone in flawless Russian, cold, controlled, and sharp enough to cut glass. Emma Collins stood frozen behind the counter of Rosario's diner, a stranger's luxury phone pressed against her ear. Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her chest. She had only answered because she thought someone needed help. She had no idea she had just answered the call that would destroy her entire ordinary life. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The phone had been sitting on the corner of table 7 for 11 minutes before Emma touched it. She had noticed it almost immediately after the group of men left, 4 of them, maybe 5. She hadn't counted carefully because something about their presence made her instinctively look away. That was the thing about certain kinds of men. They didn't demand attention. They simply occupied space differently than everyone else, and your body registered the difference before your mind could catch up. Emma had been waiting tables at Rosario's for going on 3 years, and she had served enough people to develop a quiet instinct about her customers. Loud men were usually harmless. Quiet men with expensive shoes were something else entirely. These men had been extraordinarily quiet. They ordered in clipped, precise sentences. They didn't ask for recommendations. They didn't look at the specials board. They spoke occasionally to one another in low voices, and when they did, it was in a language Emma didn't immediately identify from across the room. She assumed business. She assumed wealthy business. The kind of business that happened in rooms ordinary people were never allowed inside. She brought their food. She refilled their water twice. She said, "Enjoy your meal," and meant nothing by it and got nothing back. When the check came, one of the men placed cash on the table without looking at it more than twice the total, and that was that. They filed out the door the same way they had come in, quietly and completely, like a tide pulling back. Emma started clearing the table. That was when she found the phone. It was face down between the salt shaker and the window, and it was not like any phone she had ever held before. The weight of it was different. The material was different. She turned it over, and the screen lit up immediately. No password prompt, just a home screen with no apps visible and a single contact label at the top showing a name she didn't immediately recognize: Dmitri. Dmitri. She knew that name. She knew it the way she knew a handful of Russian words, which was the same way she knew how to make borscht from scratch, and how to count to 20, and how to say goodnight in a voice that sounded like her grandmother's kitchen at 9 o'clock on a winter evening. Bits and pieces of a world her grandmother had carried across an ocean and tried to press into Emma's hands before her hands were large enough to hold it all. Emma stood there holding the phone and thought, I should give this to Marco. Marco was her manager, and he handled Lost and Found with a kind of weary professionalism that came from years of retrieving reading glasses, umbrellas, and once an entire briefcase that had turned out to belong to a city alderman. Marco would know what to do. Marco would put it behind the counter and write a note, and eventually someone would come back for it. She was already turning toward the service window when the phone began to ring. The ringtone was just a tone, nothing personalized, but the name on the screen stopped her. Dmitri. Dmitri was calling. Emma stared at it ringing in her hand and thought about everything her grandmother had ever told her about answering doors and picking up phones that weren't yours. Her grandmother had been a woman of strong opinions on that particular subject. Some doors, she used to say, you push open not knowing what's waiting on the other side. And by the time you understand what you've walked into, the door is already closed behind you. Emma had always thought that was just something old women said to make young women more careful. She answered the phone. Hello. The voice that came back was in Russian. Fast, precise Russian, not the careful, deliberate Russian of textbooks or language tapes, but the Russian of someone who had grown up with it, filling the air around them, who thought in it and dreamed in it, and used it as casually as breathing. The voice said something along the lines of, "Why are you calling from this number?" Except it wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Emma's whole body went still the way bodies go still when the brain is suddenly working very hard. 3 years of reaching for Russian words whenever the language surfaced at a restaurant, in a film. In a song her grandmother had hummed, all of it arrived at once. She found herself responding not in the careful, translated in her head Russian of a language student, but in something closer to instinct. "I'm not calling," she said in Russian. "I work at the restaurant. Someone left this phone." Silence. Not the silence of a bad connection. The silence of a person who is recalibrating rapidly. Then, "Who are you?" His voice was lower now. Different. Whatever the first question had been, routine automatic, vaguely irritated, this one was something else. Emma heard the shift in it and couldn't entirely name what she was hearing. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't welcome. It was the kind of attention that made you suddenly aware of where you were standing. "My name is Emma," she said. "I'm a waitress. The men at table 7, I think one of them left their phone." Another silence, shorter this time. "You speak Russian?" "A little." That was not a little. Emma didn't know what to say to that. She looked up and through the front window of the diner at the street outside, as though someone might be watching her from out there, though she didn't know why she thought that. "I learned from my grandmother," she said. "I'm sorry, is there someone I should give the phone to? Should I hold on to it at the counter?" "Don't move," the man said. The line went dead. Emma stood there holding the phone for a full 15 seconds before she put it on the counter in front of her and exhaled. Her heart was beating at a pace she recognized from near misses in traffic and one particularly bad experience on an icy road 2 winters ago. The kind of heartbeat that meant something just happened and your body knew before you did. "Emma!" Janelle, the other waitress on the dinner shift, appeared at her shoulder. "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost." "Someone left their phone," Emma said. "Oh yeah, those guys were weird. Did you see their cars out front? The black ones?" Emma hadn't looked. She looked now through the window. 3 black vehicles sitting in a line at the curb outside. Not parked exactly. Idling. "Probably just waiting for someone," Janelle said, already moving on to her next table. Emma watched the cars. The front door of Rosario's opened 4 minutes later. He came in alone, which was the first thing that surprised her, because men like the ones who had sat at table 7 didn't usually go anywhere alone. He was taller than she'd registered from across the room during dinner service, and he moved through the crowded diner floor the way a hand moves through water, displacing everything around him without any apparent effort. He wasn't looking at the tables or the booths or the other customers. He was looking at the counter. He was looking directly at Emma. She had served him water twice during the dinner hour, and he had not looked at her once. She was a waitress, and he was the kind of man who didn't look at waitresses. That was simply the unspoken agreement of those transactions, and Emma had never resented it, because she had long since made her peace with the invisibility that came with service work. He was looking at her now. Alexander Volkov crossed Rosario's diner in about 8 steps, and stopped on the other side of the counter, and up close the details were different than the impression from across the room. He was younger than she'd thought. Not young, but younger. Maybe late 30s. The suit was charcoal gray, and the kind of quality that doesn't advertise itself. His face was arranged in an expression of complete neutrality, but his eyes, dark steady, doing something she couldn't name, were not neutral at all. He put his hand on the counter, palm down, and looked at her. "The phone," he said, in English, accented English that was nearly perfect in its construction, each word selected with the care of someone who had learned the language from books before they learned it from people. Emma slid the phone across the counter to him. He didn't pick it up immediately. He was still looking at her. "My associate called this number," he said. "Yes." "You spoke to him in Russian?" "Yes. He said your Russian sounded like you were born to it." Emma didn't know how to answer that, so she didn't. The man picked up the phone and turned it over in his hand, once a habit, a reflex, and then he slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket without checking it. His eyes came back to her. "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother," Emma said. "She came from Russia originally. She lived with us when I was young, and she refused to speak English with me. She thought it was important that I knew where she came from." "Where in Russia?" "I don't know exactly. A town I could never find on a map. Near St. Petersburg," she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a reaction. More like the echo of one. What was her name? The question surprised her. It was such a specific question, and she couldn't understand why it mattered, and she answered it automatically before she could think about whether she should. Natalia, she said. Natalia Voss. Before she married my grandfather, she was Natalia Petrova. The man went very still. It was different from the stillness he'd carried when he walked in, which had been the stillness of contained energy of a person whose internal speed was calibrated well above ordinary. This new stillness was different. This was the stillness of someone who had just heard something they were not expecting, and whose mind was working to understand the implications of what they'd heard. Petrova, he said quietly. Yes. Emma frowned slightly. Why does that mean something to you? He didn't answer. His eyes moved away from her for the first time since he'd walked up to the counter, moved away, and then came back. And when they came back, they were different. She still couldn't name what she was seeing. It wasn't warmth, it wasn't welcome, but it was something that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. What time does your shift end? He asked. Why? Because I have a question I'd like to ask you, properly. He reached into his jacket again and produced a card which he placed on the counter between them. Plain white. A name and a number, nothing else. Call that number when you finish tonight and tell them where you're parked. Someone will meet you there to ensure you get home safely. Emma looked at the card and then looked back at him. I don't need... This isn't about what you need, he said. The words weren't harsh. They were simply precise, the same way all his English was precise. It's about what I want to make certain of. There's a difference. He picked up the card and held it out to her. Please. The please surprised her. She wasn't sure why exactly, except that it sat oddly in his sentence, like a word he didn't use often and was making an effort to reach for. She took the card. He nodded once, a small economic movement, and turned and walked back through the diner the same way he'd walked in without hurry, without acknowledgement of anyone around him, and out the front door into the cold Chicago night. Emma stood at the counter holding his card and tried to understand what had just happened. She looked down at the name printed on it. Alexander Volkov. She didn't know the name. She didn't know why she would. She turned the card over blank on the back and tucked it into the front pocket of her apron and went back to work because the Thursday dinner rush was still going and Table 12 needed their check and she had 4 hours left on her shift. But her hands weren't entirely steady for the rest of the evening. She didn't call the number. She told herself it was because she had enough sense not to get into a car arranged by a strange man she'd met for 4 minutes in the diner where she worked. She told herself it was because she was a practical person with an ordinary life, and she had no interest in whatever complicated arrangement that card represented. She walked to her car in the staff lot behind the building and drove home the way she always drove home up Michigan Avenue and then west on Fullerton. And she put the card in the kitchen drawer with the takeout menus and the spare batteries and the instruction manual for a coffee maker she'd owned for 2 years and never read. She thought about it twice in the next 3 days. Both times she pushed the thought away. On the 4th day, her landlord called. He was a man named Gerald who had owned the building on Loomis Street for 30 years and had raised Emma's rent twice in the 3 years she'd lived there, and each time had apologized with the tone of a man who felt genuinely bad about it without feeling bad enough to stop. He called now to tell her that effective the 1st of next month, the rent was going up again this time by $340, and that he understood it was a significant increase, but costs were costs, and she should let him know if she intended to renew her lease. Emma sat at her kitchen table after the call and did the math on a scratch paper, because sometimes seeing numbers written down made them more manageable, and this time they were not more manageable. With the car payment and the minimum payments on her 2 credit cards and the utility bills that had spiked last winter and hadn't fully come back down, she was already budgeting herself down to the margin. $340 more per month meant something had to give. She pulled open the kitchen drawer and looked at the card for a long time. Then she put it back and closed the drawer. The next morning, Marco called. Hey, Em. Listen, I'm really sorry about this, but corporate is making us cut the midweek double shifts. Budget thing, apparently. So, starting next week, I can only give you Tuesdays and Thursdays for dinner, and then the weekend lunch shifts if you want them. Emma closed her eyes. That's almost a 40% cut, Marco. I know. I'm sorry. I tried to push back, but it came down from upstairs, and there's nothing I can do. If something opens up, I'll let you know. She thanked him and hung up the phone. She went to the kitchen drawer. She took out the card. She told herself she wasn't making a decision. She was just making a call. You could always hang up. The line rang twice, and then a man answered. Not Alexander Volkov, someone else. A voice she didn't recognize, and he said simply, "Yes. My name is Emma Collins," she said. "I met Mr. Volkov at Rosario's diner 4 days ago. He asked me to call this number." A pause. Brief, efficient. "Yes, Miss Collins. He's been expecting your call. Are you available to meet tomorrow at 11? She had a Tuesday lunch shift, which she could now apparently no longer count on. "Yes," she said. The address was a building on LaSalle Street that Emma walked past twice before she confirmed it was the right number because nothing about the exterior announced itself as belonging to a person like Alexander Volkov. It was a regular commercial building, mid-century construction with a security desk in the lobby and an elevator that required a keycard past the 3rd floor. A woman met her in the lobby, mid-30s. Efficient, polite, in the manner of a person who was paid to be polite rather than inclined to it, and took her up to the 8th floor, which was a floor that had apparently been entirely dedicated to a suite of offices that were carefully, almost aggressively understated. No artwork on the walls. No ostentatious furniture. A long conference table in one room. A desk that faced the door in another. Alexander Volkov was standing at the window when Emma was shown in. He turned when she entered, and there it was again, that quality of attention, that sense of being fully and entirely seen by a pair of eyes that were accustomed to assessing things quickly and filing the results somewhere permanent. He was wearing a different suit today, charcoal giving way to navy, and he looked exactly as controlled as he had in the diner, except that in this room, without the noise and motion of a restaurant around him, the control was more visible somehow. You could see the work of it. "Miss Collins," he said. "Thank you for coming." "You said you had a question," Emma said. She'd decided on the way over that she was not going to be deferential, that she was going to be exactly who she was. A 25-year-old waitress from the North Side who was trying to figure out her utility bills, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise or try to perform a version of herself that seemed more appropriate to this room. "What is it?" He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it, just the edge before it disappeared. "I appreciate directness." "I don't have a lot of time to waste," she said. "What's the question?" He gestured toward the chair across from his desk and waited until she sat, and then he sat too, folding his hands on the desk with an ease that suggested he was not a man who fidgeted. "I need a translator," he said. "Russian English, occasional German, when situations require it. Someone who can be present in meetings where the stakes are significant and where I need to be certain of what is actually being said versus what is being claimed to be said." Emma looked at him. "You want to hire me as a translator?" "Yes. I'm a waitress." "I know what you are." "I have a food handler's certificate and 3 years of experience carrying plates. I don't have a degree in linguistics or a certification in professional translation or—" "Your Russian isn't a certificate," he said. "It's something else. My associate, the man whose call you answered, has spent 15 years working in international business. He said in 20 years he has met 3 people whose fluency in a second language had that quality." He paused. He used the word native. He said it sounded native. Emma felt something she couldn't name move through her. Not pride exactly, something more complicated than pride. Something connected to her grandmother's kitchen and the smell of tea and the sound of a language being spoken by someone who loved it. "I'm not a criminal," she said. "I want to be clear about that. If this is—" "I'm not asking you to be one," he said. "What are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that felt considered not evasive. I'm asking you to be present, to listen, to tell me accurately and completely what people are saying in rooms where decisions are being made, and to be someone I can trust to do that correctly. Why would you trust me? I don't, he said. Not yet, but I'm prepared to consider the possibility. Emma sat with that for a moment. Through the window behind him, she could see the Chicago River far below, dark and moving between its banks. She thought about the kitchen drawer and the scratch paper and the math that hadn't worked out. What does it pay? She asked. He told her. She did not react visibly, which she was somewhat proud of, because the number he named was more than she made in 3 months at Rosario's, and he said it the way people say numbers they are accustomed to being allowed to say. There are conditions, he said. I assumed. You don't repeat what you hear, not to anyone, not to friends, not in journals you keep privately, not in thoughts you speak aloud in empty rooms. What happens in those meetings exists nowhere else. That's a lot of conditions. There are more. He reached into a folder on his desk and produced a document of several pages. My legal team prepared this. It outlines the terms of the arrangement. You'll want to have your own attorney review it. He paused. If you have one. I'll find one, Emma said, which was not exactly true, but was the kind of thing she was going to make true before this went any further. She looked at the document, but didn't pick it up yet. She looked back at him. The question, she said. You said you had a question to ask me. Properly. He held her gaze. Your grandmother's maiden name was Petrova. Yes. Before she married, what did she do in Russia? Emma frowned. She was a young woman. I don't know. She never talked much about her life before she came here. I used to ask, and she would change the subject. Did she ever mention an organization, a group she was part of, or a family she worked for? No, never. Did she ever mention a name, Volkov, for instance? The air in the room changed. Emma felt it change before she fully understood why. She looked at him differently now, the question doing something to the space between them that the previous questions hadn't done. Are you telling me, she said slowly, that you knew my grandmother? No, he said. I'm telling you that I knew of her, and that there is information I recently received about your family history that I believe you deserve to hear. His hands unfolded on the desk. But I want to ask first, before I tell you anything, whether you want to know. Why would I not want to know? Because some information changes things, he said. Permanently. You understand what I mean by that. Emma understood exactly what he meant by that. She had understood it in a way from the moment she'd answered the phone 4 days ago. Some doors, her grandmother had said. Some doors you push open, and then the door is behind you. Tell me, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he began. Dad. She left the building on LaSalle Street 2 hours later with the contract in her bag unread and a story in her head that she couldn't put in any order that made sense yet. She walked 3 blocks north before she stopped at a crosswalk and stood there while the light changed twice without moving. Her grandmother Natalia Petrova had not simply left Russia. She had been taken out of Russia by a network of people who arranged such things. Quiet departures, new documents, new histories in exchange for the protection of certain assets. Assets that in this case meant information, certain names, certain transactions, certain records kept by a man who had spent decades building something in the dark and who had trusted Natalia Petrova for reasons Alexander hadn't fully explained yet with a piece of its map. Emma didn't have that map. She didn't even know the map existed. But apparently, and this was the part she kept returning to, the part she couldn't fold down flat in her mind. Apparently the people who wanted the map believed she might. And they had, according to Alexander Volkov, been looking for her for some time. She stood at the crosswalk on LaSalle Street and thought about her grandmother, about the way she used to answer certain questions by going to the stove and doing something with a pot that didn't need doing, about the way she sometimes looked out windows with an expression that had nothing to do with what was outside them, about all the stories she told about Russia that were full of landscapes and food and festivals, and somehow empty of people. Deliberately empty. Natalia Petrova had carried a secret for 60 years, and she had carried it alone, and she had pressed Russian into her granddaughter's hands like a key to a door she never planned to name. Emma thought, "What did you give me, babushka? What did you give me and why?" She pulled out her phone and called her apartment to check her voicemail. Old habit. She still had a landline, one of the few things Gerald the landlord hadn't yet found a way to charge her extra for, and there was a message from a number she didn't recognize. A man's voice, not Alexander's, and not his associates. A different voice, smooth and accented, and slightly too casual for the words it was delivering. "Miss Collins," the message said. "My name is not important right now. I understand you had a conversation today with an associate of mine, a mutual acquaintance, let's call him. I would very much like to have a similar conversation with you at your convenience. I believe we may have things of interest to discuss regarding your family background. Please don't hesitate to reach out." A number followed. Chicago area code. Emma deleted the message and stood on the sidewalk in the thin October wind and thought very carefully about what it meant that someone else had already found her. The crosswalk signal changed to walk. She didn't move. She pulled Alexander Volkov's card out of her pocket, not the one from the kitchen drawer, the second one he'd given her today with a different number on it, the one he'd said was direct, and she looked at it, and then she put it back. She needed to think. She had approximately 36 hours, she understood instinctively, before whatever was already in motion arrived at her door. She didn't know how she knew that. Some part of her, that had been quietly and visibly learning things from her grandmother for 20 years, knew it the way her grandmother had known things, not from information, but from the quality of silence that surrounded information. Her grandmother had survived by running. Emma was going to have to decide whether she ran or whether she stood still. She started walking, not toward the train, toward the river. She needed to hear herself think. Her name was Emma Collins, and she was 25 years old, and she had grown up believing she was ordinary, which was something she had never resented and never questioned, because there was nothing wrong with ordinary. Ordinary was the smell of her grandmother's kitchen and the rhythm of a double shift, and the specific satisfaction of getting through a month with the bills paid and a little left over. Ordinary was knowing where you stood. She was not standing anywhere she recognized now. The river was low and dark, and it moved the way rivers always move, with the patience of things that have been moving far longer than anything watching them. And Emma stood at the railing on the riverwalk and let the cold off the water hit her face, and tried to arrange the last 4 days into a shape that made sense. 1, she had answered a phone that wasn't hers. 2, she had spoken Russian to a man whose voice told her without telling her that speaking Russian to him was going to mean something. 3, Alexander Volkov had come back for his phone and had looked at her the way people look at things they suddenly have a reason to remember. 4, he had told her today that her grandmother was not who she thought she was, or not only who she thought she was, that there was a version of Natalia Petrova that existed in the history of certain rooms Emma had never been inside, and that this version was connected to something old and dangerous, and very much not finished. 5, someone else had found her number and called it. Emma breathed cold air and thought about the contrast between those 2 calls. Alexander's manner versus the other man's, and how the difference between them was the difference between someone who wanted to employ her and someone who wanted to use her, and how she could feel that difference in her body as precisely as she felt the temperature of the wind. She pulled out her phone. She called the number on Alexander's card. He answered on the second ring, which she hadn't expected, and his voice was the same as it always was. Controlled, precise, the product of enormous discipline applied to something that wanted to be otherwise. "Someone called my apartment," she said. "I don't know how they got my number. A man. He mentioned a mutual acquaintance your name without saying it. He left a number." A pause, 1 breath long. "Don't call it." "I wasn't going to." "Good. He already knew who I was," Emma said. "He knew about the conversation today. That means someone told him, or he already had me under some kind of surveillance, and either possibility is, I know." "Do you want to tell me which one it is?" Another pause. Longer. She heard something in the background on his end. Not voices, just space, the particular acoustic of a large room. "I believe he had your name before today," Alexander said. "I believe he has been looking for you for some time, before I knew you existed." Emma stared at the river. "Why?" "Because of your grandmother, because of what she knew, because of what certain people believe she passed on." His voice was completely even. No alarm in it, which somehow made it more alarming. "They believe you have something, Miss Collins. Something your grandmother gave you that you may not even know you have." "What?" "That," he said, "is what I intend to find out, before they do." Emma gripped the railing with her free hand and felt the cold metal of it, and thought about her grandmother at the stove stirring something that didn't need stirring, and looking out a window at something that wasn't there. "Okay," she said. Silence on his end, as though the word had surprised him. "Okay," he repeated. "I'll sign the contract," Emma said. "But I have my own conditions." The pause that followed was different from his previous ones. There was something in it she hadn't heard from him before. She thought later that it might have been the first thing she'd said that had genuinely caught him off guard. "Name them," he said. "I get answers," she said. "Real ones, not managed ones, not the version you decide is safe for me to have. If I'm being watched by someone, if my grandmother's history is what's pulling them toward me, then I have the right to know exactly what that history is. That may not be safe." "I didn't ask if it was safe," Emma said. "I asked if I could know." Another pause. She heard him breathe. "Yes," he said. "You can know." She let go of the railing and turned away from the river. "I'll have the contract reviewed by Friday," she said. "I'll be in your office Monday morning." She hung up before he could respond. She stood on the riverwalk for another minute with the wind in her face and the river moving behind her and her heartbeat doing something complicated in her chest. Her grandmother had left Russia with a map she never named, and she had placed the language that opened the map in Emma's hands, and she had never said, "Someday someone will come looking for what I carried. Someday the door will open from the other side. Someday a phone will ring, and a man's voice will ask who you are, and you will answer in the language I gave you, and then you will understand why I gave it." Emma Collins had spent 25 years being ordinary. She understood walking back toward the train in the October dark that ordinary was over, and what replaced it was going to depend entirely on what she chose to do next. She chose to walk. She chose to keep going. And behind her in this dark water of the Chicago River, the city's lights moved and scattered and moved again the way everything moved in this city, with the restless, relentless, unquiet energy of something that had been running a very long time and had never once slowed down enough to tell you what it was running toward. She signed the contract on a Friday afternoon in a law office she'd found through a legal aid referral with an attorney named Diane Cho, who spent 40 minutes reading every page and then looked up at Emma with an expression that was professionally neutral but personally concerned. "This is a significant confidentiality agreement," Diane said. "I know. The penalty clauses are extensive." "I know." "Emma." Diane set the papers down. "I have to ask you directly. Do you know who Alexander Volkov is? Not the company name on this document. The man." Emma looked at her. "Tell me what you know." Diane folded her hands. "What I know is rumor. What I know is the kind of thing that circulates at certain levels of this city and never makes it into print, because the people who know it like their livelihoods and prefer to keep them." She paused. "The name Volkov is connected to organized crime activity going back 15 years on the East Coast. Nothing proven, nothing charged. But the connection is consistent enough that the people who track these things track him." Another pause. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes," Emma said. "And you still want to sign this?" Emma thought about the voicemail she'd deleted, the number with the Chicago area code, the smooth voice that had known her name before she'd done anything to deserve being known. She thought about the math on the scratch paper and the $340 and Marco's apologetic phone call. She thought about her grandmother at the window watching something that wasn't there. "Yes," she said. I still want to sign. Diane passed her the pen. Monday morning came cold and overcast, and Emma arrived at the building on LaSalle Street at 5 minutes before 11. The same woman met her in the lobby. The same elevator, the same keycard, the same 8th floor. But this time, the office was not empty. There were 2 other men at the conference table when she walked in, both in their 40s, both carrying the particular posture of men who were accustomed to rooms where decisions had weight, and Alexander was already standing when she entered, which she noticed and filed away, without knowing exactly what to do with it. Miss Collins. He gestured to a chair at the table. These are 2 of my senior associates. They'll be present for your initial briefings. Emma sat. She looked at the 2 men, and they looked back at her with the measured assessment of people who had been told something about her, and were now comparing the reality to the report. What kind of briefings? She said. Background, Alexander said. There are meetings coming up over the next 3 weeks. Russian counterparts, some of whom I have worked with for years, and some of whom I have recently been introduced to. I need to know 2 things from you at all times during those meetings. He sat across from her. First, what they're actually saying. Second, what they're not saying but meaning. The second one is harder, Emma said. I know. That's why I need someone who grew up with the language rather than learned it. One of the men at the table, the one on the left, heavier set with the kind of patience on his face that comes from years of watching things develop, slowly said in Russian, Tell me what I just said. Emma looked at him. You said, Tell me what I just said. Your accent places you from somewhere around Chelyabinsk, or possibly Yekaterinburg. You've been in this country long enough that your cadence has changed, but not long enough that the vowel sounds have. She paused. You also swallowed the ending on the verb, which suggests you're tired, or you're testing me, and you're doing it carelessly, which means you think this is probably a formality. The man stared at her. Then he looked at Alexander. Alexander said nothing. The man on the right, thinner, younger, with watchful eyes that hadn't left Emma's face since she sat down, said also in Russian, and faster. What about me? Petersburg, Emma said without hesitating. Old city, educated family, probably professional class. You learned formal Russian before you learned street Russian, and it shows in the structure of your sentences, even when you're trying to speak casually. You don't entirely trust me yet, but you're more open to it than your colleague. She paused. And you're not tired. The thin man looked at Alexander. Alexander looked at Emma. When can you start? He said. I already did, she said. The first meeting was 3 days later. It was in a private room at a hotel in River North that Emma had walked past 100 times without ever having been inside, and it seated 8 people at a rectangular table, and she sat at the end beside Alexander with a small notepad and no instructions other than, tell me what I need to know when I need to know it. The Russian delegation arrived 20 minutes late, which Emma could tell immediately was intentional, and the man who led them into the room was older, mid-60s, compact with a head of white hair and the kind of smile that was entirely constructed from experience rather than feeling. He greeted Alexander in English and shook hands the way people shake hands when the handshake is a data-gathering exercise. His name was Konstantin Baranov, and Emma knew within 4 minutes of him sitting down that he was not who he had represented himself to be. She knew it because of what he said to the man beside him in Russian, which was low and fast, and not meant to be understood by anyone at the table except his own people. What he said was, "The girl is new, watch what she writes." Emma wrote nothing. She waited. For 20 minutes, the meeting proceeded in English the way meetings like this always began. Formal surface level, the trading of positions that everyone in the room already knew. Alexander was precise and unhurried. Baranov was expansive and charming. Neither of them was saying anything real. Then Baranov switched to Russian smoothly, and without announcement addressing Alexander directly, and smiling as he did it, as though the language shift were simply a courtesy, a gesture of ease. He said, "I think we can speak more freely this way. My English is not as good as yours, and I find it frustrating when my words don't land correctly. I'm sure you understand." Alexander, whose Russian was excellent, but who always used translators in formal settings for the legal record it provided, turned to Emma. Emma translated it precisely. Baranov's eyes moved to her. He said, still in Russian, and now with the smile going slightly fixed at the edges. "Your translator is very good." Emma translated that too. Then Baranov said, and this was the moment, the sentence she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. "Tell me, Alexander Dmitrievich, and tell me honestly, because we are speaking now like men who have known each other long enough for honesty. Are you certain about the Petrova matter? Are you certain this is the direction?" The room temperature didn't change, but something did. Emma translated it exactly. Alexander's expression didn't change either. "Ask him what specifically concerns him about it," he said to her in English. Emma looked at Baranov. "Mr. Volkov asks what your specific concern is." Baranov's smile went thin. He had expected something different. She could see it, the micro-adjustment of a man whose expectation had just been quietly undercut. He had expected that the name Petrova would produce a reaction, and that the reaction would tell him something. He hadn't expected Alexander to immediately redirect. "I have no concern," Baranov said in Russian, and now the edges of his words were different. "I simply want to be certain we are aligned." Emma translated. Under the table, Alexander slid a folded piece of paper to her without moving the rest of his body at all. She opened it in her lap. It said, "He knows your name. Be careful." Emma kept her face exactly where it was. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and looked at Baranov across the table and thought, "So, this is how this works." This is the room her grandmother had known about from the outside. The room where what people said and what people meant were two separate conversations running in parallel, and you needed to hear both simultaneously to understand either. She thought about her grandmother, and she thought you knew this room. You lived near it for years, and you left it behind, and you never said why. Emma was sitting at the table inside it. The meeting continued for another hour. But afterward, alone in the elevator on the way down, Alexander looked straight ahead at the closed doors and said quietly, "What did he mean by the Petrova matter?" "He thinks you've made a decision about me," Emma said. "He's not sure what the decision is, but he thinks it commits you to something. And whatever he thinks you're committed to, he doesn't like it." "Does he know who you are?" "Not fully," Emma said. "He knows my name came up somewhere. He doesn't know the connection to your operation specifically. He was fishing." "Did he catch anything?" Emma looked at the closed elevator doors. "Ask me in 2 weeks," she said. The elevator opened. Alexander stopped before stepping out and turned to look at her directly, which he did rarely. She was already learning he was a man who looked at things on angles as though coming at anything head-on was a tactical choice he reserved for specific moments. "You did well," he said. "I know," Emma said. She stepped out first. She heard something behind her that might have been the almost sound of him almost laughing, which was so unlike everything she had so far understood about him that she didn't turn around to verify it. She was careful. She was careful in the way that her grandmother had been careful. Which she understood now was not timidity, but precision, the specific discipline of a person who knew that the world they were moving through had sharp edges and moved at speed. She didn't talk about her work. She didn't ask questions outside of meetings. She didn't look at documents she wasn't given. She took notes that were factual and exact and surrendered them to Alexander's office at the end of each session, without making copies. She was also in those first 2 weeks learning things. Not about the business, she kept herself deliberately ignorant of the larger architecture of whatever Alexander was managing, because she understood intuitively that knowing less was a form of protection. What she learned was something harder to categorize. She learned the way he moved through a room. She learned the specific quality of his silences, which ones were waiting, which ones were thinking, which ones were something else she couldn't name yet. She learned that he had 3 different ways of asking the same question, each one pitched at a different level of seriousness, and that if you were paying attention, you could tell exactly how much he needed the answer before he finished the sentence. She learned that the 2 associates from her first morning, Gregor, the heavy-set one from Chelyabinsk, and Pavel, the thin, watchful one from Petersburg, were men who had been with Alexander for a long time and who were loyal, the way people are loyal when their loyalty has been tested and they chose it anyway. She learned that there was a third associate she hadn't met yet. A man named Dmitri, which was the name from the phone on the night this had all begun, and that his absence from the office in those first 2 weeks was notable enough that Pavel mentioned it once and then stopped mentioning it. She learned that Alexander Volkov ate the same lunch every day, something from a place 3 blocks away, that she never saw the name of delivered in a plain container, and that he worked later than everyone else and was in the office earlier than everyone else, and that this was not performance, but simply what his life looked like, which was to say, his life was almost entirely work. She learned one other thing in those first 2 weeks, and it was the thing that was hardest to put words around. She learned that he watched her. Not constantly, not obviously. But there were moments in meetings in the elevator at the end of the conference table, when the last people were filing out, when she'd look up and catch the very end of his attention moving away, as though he'd been looking and then wasn't, as though being caught looking was something to avoid. She didn't know what it meant. She filed at the same place she filed the other things she didn't understand yet, which was in the part of her mind that just kept track without demanding explanations. What she did know was that her work was good. She knew it from results from the small nods in meetings, when she caught something the other side had tried to hide, from the absence of mistakes, from the quality of the information she was able to pull from conversations that were designed to obscure. And she knew it from the way Gregor, who had looked at her on the first morning, like she was a pleasant if unlikely experiment, now looked at her across conference tables with the specific respect of a man who has been surprised and is willing to admit it. Pavel said it out loud one evening when Emma was putting on her coat to leave. "You know," he said, "I've worked with 4 different translators for Alexander over the past 8 years. Good people, trained people. You're different from them." "How?" Emma said. "They translated what people said," Pavel said. "You translate what people mean." He paused. "That's not a skill you can teach someone." Emma buttoned her coat. "My grandmother used to say that every language has 2 layers, the words on top and the truth underneath. If you only hear the words, you're only getting half the conversation." Pavel was quiet for a moment. "Smart woman." "Yes," Emma said, "she was." She left without saying anything else. On the train home, she thought about what Pavel had said, and she thought about what it meant that she was good at this, genuinely good, in a way that waitressing had never asked of her and had therefore never revealed. She thought about how strange it was that her grandmother's kitchen, the thing she'd always thought of as the softest and most domestic part of her past, had been quietly preparing her for something that was neither soft nor domestic. She got off at her stop and walked to her building and climbed the stairs and unlocked her door and went to the kitchen and stood at the counter in the dark for a moment before turning on the light. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like the Chicago skyline that she'd bought at a gas station years ago, was the one photograph she had of her grandmother. Natalia Petrova Collins, in her 60s by then, sitting at the kitchen table in the house Emma had grown up in, with a cup of tea in front of her, and her hands folded, and her eyes looking at the camera with the particular expression of someone who is allowing themselves to be photographed while remaining entirely private. Emma looked at the photograph for a long time. "What did you know?" she said quietly. "What did you know that you didn't tell me?" The photograph said nothing. Emma made tea and sat at her own kitchen table and thought about the name Konstantin Baranov had used in that hotel room. The Petrova matter. Said with the careful smoothness of a man who had prepared the phrase in advance, who had known it would land somewhere. She hadn't let it land. She'd translated it and moved on and kept her face where it was. But it had landed. It was landing still. 11 days into her work for Alexander, Dmitri came back. She knew it was him before anyone introduced them, because the moment he walked into the 8th floor suite that morning, Gregor and Pavel both shifted in a way that was subtle and immediate, and had nothing to do with welcome, and everything to do with alertness. Like 2 men who had been relaxed and had just remembered not to be. Dmitri was younger than she'd imagined from his voice on the phone, early 40s she guessed, and there was something about him that was immediately and specifically different from the other men in Alexander's orbit. Where they were controlled, he was easy. Where they were watchful, he was open. He smiled immediately and broadly when he saw her, which nobody else in this office had done on a first meeting. "You're Emma," he said in English, extending his hand. "Yes," she said. "I owe you an apology. I was not at my most gentlemanly on the phone that night. I was in the middle of something difficult, and I spoke to you like an obstacle. You were not an obstacle." His English was excellent, but different from Alexander's warmer, more colloquial, the kind that comes from learning a language by living in it rather than studying it. "I hope you'll forgive me." Emma shook his hand. "Already forgotten." He smiled wider. "She's a liar too. Alexander, I like her." Alexander, who had come in behind Dmitri without Emma noticing, said from somewhere to her left, "She's not a liar. She's being gracious. There's a difference." "Is there?" Dmitri said. "Yes," Alexander said. "She remembers. She's choosing not to hold it." Dmitri looked at Emma. "Does he talk about you like you're not in the room often?" "Just started," Emma said. Dmitri laughed a real laugh, the kind that had nothing constructed about it. And Emma thought, this is the person Alexander trusts most. She knew it the way she knew regional accents, which was not from study, but from something that landed directly bypassing analysis. She also thought Dmitri is afraid of something. And the fear has to do with why he was gone and why he's back, and he is covering it with every gram of warmth and ease at his disposal. She filed that too. Niente. That afternoon, Dmitri pulled her aside in the hallway outside the conference room. "I need to ask you something," he said, and the easy warmth was still there, but something had shifted underneath it. "And I need you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is that you don't know." "Okay," Emma said. "Have you been contacted by anyone outside this office since you started working here? Anyone you didn't recognize? Anyone who seemed to know more about you than they should?" Emma looked at him. "The voicemail," she said. "Before I signed the contract, I told Alexander." "Yes, anyone since—" She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, cataloging the past 11 days. "No," she said. "Nothing since." Dmitri nodded slowly. He was looking at something over her shoulder, or looking at nothing, which was the same expression she'd seen on Alexander during meetings, the face of someone whose mind was moving faster than the room around them. "Good," he said. "That's good." He looked back at her. "If that changes, I want to know immediately. Before you tell Alexander, can you do that?" The request surprised her enough that she took a half-second longer than she should have before answering. Why before Alexander? Dmitri's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. "Because there are things happening right now that Alexander doesn't know the full shape of yet. And until he does, it's better that I know first, so I can decide how to give him that information in a way that doesn't cause him to make a decision before he has the whole picture." Emma studied him. "Are you protecting him or managing him?" Dmitri smiled. "Good question." He straightened. "Both probably. In this case, they're the same thing." He held her gaze. "Will you tell me first?" She thought about it. About what it meant to agree to that, and what it meant to refuse it, and which choice was more dangerous, and whether dangerous was even the right measure. "Yes," she said. "If that changes, I'll tell you first." He nodded. "Thank you." He started to move back toward the conference room, then stopped. "Emma." He turned back. "Your grandmother. Did she ever mention someone named Malenkov, Viktor Malenkov?" The name hit her somewhere specific. She didn't know why. She had never heard it before. She was almost certain she had never heard it, but it hit her the way certain Russian words had hit her, as a child words her grandmother had used that had weight to them, that vibrated at a different frequency from ordinary words. "No," she said. "I never heard that name." Dmitri looked at her for a moment. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because he's heard yours," Dmitri said. "For a long time. Years, apparently." He paused. "Since before you were born." He walked back into the conference room. Emma stood in the hallway and let the sentence arrange itself in the air in front of her and tried to understand the shape of it. Since before she was born. A man named Viktor Malenkov had known her name, known something about her since before she was born, which meant this wasn't about her. This was never about her. This was about something her grandmother had been carrying. Something that had been waiting patient and entirely invisible for the generation that came after Natalia Petrova to reach the right age and the right place for it to collect. Emma thought, Babushka, what did you start? What did you start that I don't know I'm in the middle of? She walked back into the conference room and sat down at the table and opened her notepad and clicked her pen. Across the table, Alexander looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them in that second. She couldn't name it and didn't try to. And then they both looked away, and the afternoon meeting began, and Emma translated words and meanings simultaneously and kept everything on her face exactly where she put it. But inside, something had changed. Inside, something that had been quietly uncertain had made a decision. She was not going to be the person this story happened to. She was going to be the person who understood it. Whatever it took to get there. The second major meeting was 2 days later, and Konstantin Baranov was not there. His absence was the most important thing in the room. A different man came in his place, younger, sharper, less careful about what his face did, and he introduced himself as an associate of Baranov's and spent the first 10 minutes delivering compliments and explanations for Baranov's absence that were too smooth and too detailed to be anything other than rehearsed, which meant they were also false. Emma translated all of it. She also, during a pause in the formal exchange, said very quietly in English to Alexander, "He was told to come. He doesn't know why he was told. He's working from a script, and the script didn't prepare him for you, and he's nervous about it." Alexander didn't look at her. "The proposition on the table," he said quietly. "Watch his face when I bring it back up." She watched. When Alexander redirected to the terms of the previous meeting, the younger man's face did something very fast that was over before most people would have caught it. Emma caught it. "He knows the terms have changed," she said. "He doesn't know what the new terms are. He was sent here to find that out without appearing to look for it." Alexander was quiet for 3 seconds. "Tell him," he said in English at normal volume addressing the room, "that we appreciate Mr. Baranov sending such a capable representative and that we look forward to resuming with Mr. Baranov present at the next available opportunity, and that we have nothing further to discuss today." Emma translated. The younger man's composure held mostly, but his hands moved on the table, a small rearrangement of papers that meant nothing but meant everything. He recovered quickly. He was good. She would give him that, and smiled, and said it had been a pleasure, and he would convey the message. He was gone in 4 minutes. The room held silence after he left. Then Gregor from the end of the table said in Russian, "Baranov has moved. He's no longer running point on this." "Agreed," Pavel said. Alexander was looking at Emma. "What did you see?" "He was scared," Emma said. "Not of you specifically. Of whoever sent him, and what they'll do if he goes back with the wrong report. He came here as an errand boy, but he didn't know he was an errand boy until he got here and realized the room was too big for what he'd been given." She paused. "Whoever sent him either underestimated you, or they expected a different version of this meeting. The version without me in it, maybe." The room was very quiet. Pavel said in Russian to Gregor, not to Alexander, "She's right." Gregor said nothing. He looked at the table. Alexander said to Emma in English and quietly, "What do you think it means, all of it together?" Emma set down her pen. She thought about Baranov's phrasing in the first meeting. The Petrova matter. She thought about Dmitri in the hallway, and the name Viktor Malenkov dropping into the air between them. She thought about the voicemail she'd deleted, and the smooth voice that had known her name. "Someone is restructuring," she said. "Someone is replacing the pieces on the board before you can see the new formation. Baranov pulling back, sending someone young and unprepared, the timeline accelerating. It's not confusion. It's preparation." She paused. They're getting ready to do something, and they're trying to take stock of what you know before they do it. What do they think I know? I think, Emma said carefully, they think you know something about me. The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. It was the silence of a room where everyone has just arrived at the same place from different directions. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing the thing she had never been able to decode, that contained completely private thing his face did when he was working through something he hadn't reached the end of yet. Yes, he said finally. I believe that's correct. He stood. I need to make a call, he said. Gregor, Pavel, give us the room. They left without a word, and Emma sat alone at the conference table with Alexander Volkov and waited for him to tell her something that she already in the part of her that translated meanings underneath words understood was going to be the last ordinary thing she needed to know. Whatever came after this would be the truth. Whatever came after this would be the version of this story that had no managed edges and no safe distances and no part of her name kept separate from the danger attached to it. She was ready. She had been ready since the night she'd answered a stranger's phone and spoken a dead woman's language to a man who had no business knowing it mattered. Alexander sat back down across from her. There's something I didn't tell you the first day, he said. I know, Emma said. He looked at her. Tell me now, she said. And he did. What Alexander hadn't told her on the first day was this. Natalia Petrova had not simply known about the organization that his enemies wanted control over. She had been the one who built the system that kept its records hidden. Not the organization itself. She had never been a criminal, never been a participant in the violence, or the transactions, or the machinery of power that ran underneath the surface of certain rooms. But she had been for nearly a decade, before she left Russia, the person who designed the archive. The way certain information was coded, stored cross-referenced. The way it was made to look like nothing, if you found it, and like everything, if you knew how to read it. She had built it for a man named Grigory Malenkov, Viktor Malenkov's father. Emma sat with that for a full 10 seconds without speaking. She worked for his family, she said finally. For his father, Alexander said. Grigory was not what Viktor is. He was careful in a way his son has never been. He understood that certain things needed to be protected not through force, but through invisibility. Your grandmother understood that too. That was why he trusted her with the architecture of it. And then she left. And then she left. With the key to the architecture. Not the records themselves, those stayed in a form that nobody has been able to fully decode in 60 years. But the method. The logic of the system. She carried it in her head, and she carried it out of Russia, and she never told anyone what she had. Except she taught me Russian, Emma said. Except she taught you Russian, Alexander confirmed. Emma looked at the table. She was aware of her own breathing in a way she wasn't usually aware of it. So, Viktor Malenkov thinks that she passed the method to me, that what she gave me wasn't just a language, but the way to read the system she built. Yes. Did she? Alexander looked at her directly. I don't know, he said. And that's the truth. I don't know if she encoded it somewhere in what she taught you, or if she carried it to her grave and the language is simply the language. But Viktor Malenkov believes she encoded it. He has believed it for years. And his belief is more dangerous than the truth either way. Emma sat back in her chair. She thought about her grandmother teaching her Russian. Not with textbooks, not with tapes or structured lessons, with conversation, with stories, with songs that didn't have obvious melodies and phrases that appeared in odd contexts and patterns of repetition that Emma had always assumed were just the way her grandmother's mind worked, the particular texture of a very old woman's memory. She thought about a game her grandmother had made her play every summer. A memory game, she'd called it. Sequences of Russian words grouped in ways that seemed arbitrary that Emma had to recall in exact order. She'd thought it was a language exercise. Her grandmother had praised her extravagantly whenever she got them right, and had made her practice the ones she got wrong until they were perfect. She had not thought about that game in 15 years. She thought about it now. Alexander, she said. Yes. I think she did. The room went very still. Tell me, he said. She told him about the game, the sequences, the patterns. As she talked, she watched his face do something she had never seen it do before. Not emotion exactly, but the place just before emotion. The face of a man who is receiving information that is rearranging something fundamental in his understanding of a situation he thought he already understood. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Do you remember them? He said. The sequences. I remember everything she taught me, Emma said. I always have. I thought it was just how memory worked when you learned something young enough. She paused. But I never forgot a single sequence. Not one. In 15 years. Alexander stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she watched the tension in his shoulders do something complicated. This changes the situation, he said. I know. Victor will not stop. If he has any indication that you carry what he thinks you carry. He already has indication, Emma said. You said he's been watching me. That voicemail wasn't random. He already thinks I have it. Yes. So the question isn't whether he comes, Emma said. It's when. Alexander turned from the window. His face was controlled again the emotion or the place before it folded back behind the discipline. But his eyes were doing the thing she had learned to watch for. There's something else, he said. Emma waited. The information in those records, the archive your grandmother built, it contains documentation of transactions going back 40 years. Names, amounts, arrangements. He paused. Including arrangements that connect to people who are currently in significant positions. Government positions. Law enforcement. On both sides of the ocean. Emma understood immediately. Which means the archive isn't just valuable to Victor. It's dangerous to everyone who's in it, Alexander said. And there are people who have been very motivated for a very long time to make sure it is never decoded. People who are not Viktor Malenkov. He held her gaze. People who may be willing to go further than he would to ensure it stays buried. Emma thought about that. She thought about it with the specific clarity that comes when the thing you're thinking about is your own continued existence. Are you one of them? She said. Are you in those records? The question landed in the room like a stone in water. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. My father is, he said. Emma absorbed that. And you, she said. No, he said. I came after. By the time I was doing anything worth documenting, your grandmother was already gone and the archive was already sealed. He paused. But my father's presence in those records is sufficient. So you have your own reasons for wanting the archive, Emma said. Separate from protecting me. Yes, he said. I do. She appreciated the honesty. She didn't know what to do with it yet, but she appreciated it. She sat at the conference table and looked at this man who had hired her to translate languages and had failed to mention that what he actually needed her to translate was the life's work of her dead grandmother. And she thought about the difference between being used and being in partnership with someone whose interests happen to align with yours. What do we do? She said. He looked at her. Yes, Emma said. We. My name is the one on Viktor Malenkov's list. My grandmother built the system. My head carries the key. She put her hands flat on the table. I am not a bystander in this, and I am not a resource, and I am not something to be managed. So yes, we. What do we do? Alexander stood across the table from her and looked at her with that steady, unreadable attention. And this time she didn't look away, and he didn't look away, and something in the room shifted into a different register. We find out, he said, whether what you carry is actually the key, and if it is, we decide what to do with that before Victor does. How? I know someone, he said. Someone who knew your grandmother, who worked near her during the years she was building the archive. He's old now, and he doesn't speak to people often, but he will speak to me. A pause. And he will speak to you. When? Tomorrow, Alexander said. If you're willing. Emma looked at him. "I'll be here at 8, she said. She wasn't at 8. She was at 7:45, and she sat in the lobby reading nothing on her phone and thinking about her grandmother's game until Alexander came down personally at 8:05, which told her something she filed without comment. They drove north in a black car with Gregor at the wheel and Pavel riding in front, and no one said much of anything. Emma watched the city move past the window and thought about the sequences her grandmother had made her memorize. They were still there. Every single one. Sitting in the part of her memory that felt permanent, the part where her grandmother's face lived, and the smell of the kitchen and the sound of Russian being spoken, the way it was meant to be spoken, not carefully, but abundantly, like water from a source that never ran dry. She had never questioned why she remembered them so perfectly. She questioned it now. The man they went to see lived in a neighborhood on the northwest side that Emma knew from childhood. Old brick buildings, old trees, the specific flavor of a community that had arrived from somewhere else and built its own version of home on top of the American bones of the place. He opened the door himself, which surprised her. He was in his late 70s, she guessed, and he was still straight-backed and sharp-eyed, and he wore a sweater that had been expensive 30 years ago and was now simply familiar. And when he saw Alexander, he nodded once in the precise way of men who have known each other across decades and through things that don't get spoken about. Then he looked at Emma, and his face did something she didn't expect. He looked at her the way you look at something you thought was gone. "Natalka's girl," he said, in Russian, soft and certain, not a question. "Her granddaughter," Emma said, in Russian. "Emma." He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "Both of you. I've been expecting this for a long time." His name was Arkady. That was all Alexander had told her, and that was all he offered. He made tea with the deliberate care of a man who believed that how you made tea reflected something about how you understood life, and Emma sat at his kitchen table and thought, this is her grandmother's kitchen. Not the appearance of it, not the furniture or the neighborhood, but the feeling of it, the weight of old knowledge living comfortably in an ordinary space. "You want to know about your grandmother," Arkady said. He set the tea in front of them and sat down. "And you want to know about the archive?" "Yes," Emma said. "And him?" He looked at Alexander. "He already knows about the archive," Emma said. "He's here because I asked him to be." Arkady's eyes moved between them with the assessment of a man who had spent a lifetime reading rooms. Whatever he saw, it seemed to satisfy something. "Your grandmother was the most careful person I have ever known," he said. "Not fearful. Careful. There is a difference. Fear makes you small. Care makes you precise." He wrapped both hands around his tea. She built the archive over 9 years. Every element of it designed so that without the key, what you were looking at looked like ordinary administrative records. Ledgers, correspondence, nothing. With the key you could read exactly what had been done, and by whom, and for how much. "What was the key?" Emma said. Arkady looked at her. "Not a what," he said. "A who." Emma went very still. "She was the key," Arkady said. The whole system was structured around the way her mind organized information. The categories, the cross-references, the specific patterns of association. It wasn't a code you could hand to someone else. It was the architecture of how she thought. He paused. Which meant the only way to read the archive was to find someone who thought like her. Or someone she taught to think like her, Emma said. "Yes," Arkady said quietly. Emma set down her tea. Her hands were steady. She was distantly aware of being proud of that. "The game," she said. "The memory game." Arkady looked at her with something that was not quite grief and not quite pride. "She told me she was going to do it," he said. "Before she left. She said she wasn't going to bury what she'd built, but she wasn't going to leave it where it could be weaponized either. She was going to put it somewhere safe." He paused. "I told her it was too much to put on a child. She said the child wouldn't know she was carrying it, and so the child would be safe. The knowledge couldn't be taken if the person holding it didn't know they held it." Emma heard that land. The knowledge couldn't be taken if the person holding it didn't know they held it. Her grandmother had hidden the key to a 60-year-old archive inside a summer game. Inside a granddaughter who thought she was learning a language and was actually learning something else entirely. Something that was waiting patient and invisible in the architecture of her memory. "Does it work?" Emma said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful. "If I look at the records, if I actually look at them, will I be able to read them?" Arkady looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I never knew the full system myself. Nobody did except Natalka. But I believe based on everything she told me about how she designed it and how she trained you that you would recognize it. The way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years. It would come back." Emma looked at Alexander. He was watching her. He had been watching her, she realized, since they sat down with the specific attention of a man who was waiting to see how someone handled the weight of a very large thing being placed in their hands. She thought about what the archive contained. Names, transactions, arrangements, people in significant positions, his father's name, the infrastructure of certain kinds of power going back 4 decades. She thought about Viktor Malenkov, who had been looking for her since before she was born. She thought about her grandmother at the window, watching something that wasn't there, having given her granddaughter everything she needed and nothing she could be punished for knowing. "I want to see the records," Emma said. Alexander said, "Emma, I want to see them," she said again, steadier. "Not to use them. Not yet. I want to know if she was right. I want to know if what she gave me is actually what she thought it was. And then..." She looked at him directly. "Then we decide together what to do with it." A long silence. Arkady looked at Alexander. "She sounds like Natalka," he said quietly in Russian. Alexander held Emma's gaze. "The records are not accessible from here," he said. "The location is..." "I don't need to know the location right now," Emma said. "I need to know if you'll take me there." Another pause. "Yes," Alexander said. They were back in this car heading south when Gregor's phone rang from the front seat. He answered, listened for 4 seconds, and said nothing in response. He hung up and looked in the rearview mirror at Alexander and said in Russian quietly and precisely, "Malenkov has moved. He has people in the city." Emma translated automatically before she'd decided to, "Malenkov's people are in Chicago." Pavel turned from the front seat and looked at her. Then at Alexander. Alexander's jaw was doing something, not clenched. Something more controlled than clenched. "How many?" he said. "At least 6 that we've confirmed," Gregor said. "Possibly more." "Timeline? Unknown. But they came in last night. All of them." Emma did the math on that. Last night. She and Alexander had sat in the conference room yesterday afternoon, and she had told him about the memory game, and by last night, Viktor Malenkov had moved a team into Chicago. Either the timeline was coincidence, or someone in Alexander's circle had communicated something they shouldn't have. She said it out loud. Either the timing is coincidence, or someone told him. The car was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of earlier. The sharp-loaded quiet of a space where a dangerous idea has just been released and everyone is deciding whether to look at it. Alexander said, "Yes." Pavel said, "We've been running communications security for..." "I know what we've been running," Alexander said. "Run it again." Pavel was already on his phone. Emma looked at Gregor's eyes in the rearview mirror. He was looking at the road, but his shoulders were doing something. She thought about what she'd understood about these men over the past 2 weeks, their loyalty, the way it had been tested and chosen. She thought about Dmitri, who had asked her to tell him things before she told Alexander, who had been gone for 2 weeks and had come back with a weight under his easiness that she'd registered and filed. She thought, "I need to tell Alexander about that conversation with Dmitri, and immediately, or I need to wait and see what the communication check turns up." She made a decision. "There's something I should have told you sooner," she said. To Alexander. Directly. He looked at her. She told him about Dmitri's request in the hallway. The instruction to come to Dmitri first if she was contacted from outside. The question about Viktor Malenkov's name. She watched Alexander's face very carefully while she talked. She had learned his faces. She had spent 2 weeks cataloging them, the waiting one, the thinking one, the controlled one. This was none of those. This was something new. This was the face of a man absorbing information that was hitting somewhere deep and specific, somewhere that had a history attached to it. He didn't say anything when she finished. He looked at Gregor. Gregor looked at the road. Pavel was still on his phone. "Gregor," Alexander said very quietly, "take us back to the office, the long way." "Yes," Gregor said. Emma sat beside Alexander in the back seat and felt the silence between them change shape. This was not the silence from the hotel meeting or the conference room. This was the silence of a man who had just received damage to something he'd thought was structurally sound and was now running the calculations on how much of the structure was still standing. She said quietly, "I should have told you sooner." "Yes," he said, without blame, just precisely. "I was trying to understand what his request meant before I know," he said. A pause. The city moved outside. "Is Dmitri?" she started. "I don't know," he said. "And until I know, I need you to behave as though you do not know either. Can you do that?" "Yes," Emma said. "In all conversations, in all rooms, whatever you observe, you hold it and you bring it to me and nobody else, including Dmitri." He paused. "Especially Dmitri." "Understood," she said. She meant it. Back at the office, Alexander sent Gregor and Pavel on separate tasks, and then took Emma into the inner office, not the conference room, the private one with the desk that faced the door, and closed it. He stood at the desk and looked at her, and for the first time since she'd started working for him, she had the distinct impression that he was deciding how much to say, rather than how to say what he'd already decided. "Dmitri has been my closest associate for 12 years, he said. Emma waited. "He is the person I have trusted most in a world where trust is extremely expensive." He paused. "He is also the person who introduced me to Konstantin Baranov 6 months ago." Emma took that in. "He brought Baranov to you." "Yes. He said the connection was through a mutual contact in Geneva. I had no reason to question it." His voice was still controlled. What was underneath it was something else. If Dmitri has been compromised, if Viktor Malenkov has reached him somehow, then the exposure goes back much further than yesterday. "It goes back 6 months, Emma said. "Which means Baranov was never actually your counterpart. He was a position. He was a door," Alexander said, "opened specifically to," he stopped, "to bring you to a place where the Petrova matter would come up," Emma said. "To see how you'd respond to it, to find out how much you knew." She was working through it as she spoke, the pieces arranging themselves with the specific logic of a system she was somehow already fluent in. "They knew you'd find me eventually. Once the name Petrova surfaced in your family history, they knew you'd go looking. So they moved first. Baranov was there to monitor what you knew, while Viktor put his people in position." Alexander was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him. She stopped. "What?" "Nothing," he said. But the word came out differently than his words usually did, less processed. "Say it," she said. A pause. "You just did in 3 minutes what my intelligence team has been trying to do for 6 months, he said. Emma shook her head slightly. "I'm just following the logic." "Yes," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked away from him, because looking at him in that moment was producing something she didn't entirely know what to do with. She looked at the desk instead. "We have a problem," she said. "Several. The most immediate one is Dmitri. If he's in contact with Malenkov's people, then anything we plan in this office is already on its way to Viktor," Emma said. Alexander was very still. Emma kept going. "Which means, if we want to do anything, If we want to access the records, if we want to find out what I can actually read, we can't plan it from here. We can't plan it anywhere that Dmitri has access to." She looked back at Alexander. "Where does Dmitri not go?" He thought for exactly 2 seconds. "The archive location," he said. "Dmitri knows it exists, but he's never been there. I kept it compartmentalized." He paused. "One of the few things." "Then that's where we plan from," Emma said. "Can we get there without him knowing?" "If we move today," Alexander said. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was Dmitri. They both looked at it. It rang 4 times. Alexander answered it. "Dmitri," he said. Completely normal. Nothing in his voice. Dmitri's voice came through, and Alexander held the phone slightly away from his ear, so Emma could hear. "Alex, I heard you went out to the northwest side this morning. Everything okay?" A beat. Precisely the right length of beat. "Old contact," Alexander said. "Due diligence on the Baranov situation?" Sure. Dmitri's warm voice easy and familiar. "Did you get anything useful?" "Some background. Nothing I didn't already know." "Good. Listen. I was thinking we should sit down tonight, the 4 of us go over the security situation. With Baranov going quiet, and the timing of everything." "Tomorrow," Alexander said. "I have something tonight." "Tomorrow works. 8 o'clock. 8? Alexander said. He hung up. He looked at Emma. Emma said nothing. Alexander set the phone on the desk face down. He stood with his hands on either side of it and looked at the surface of the desk for a moment, and Emma watched what that conversation had cost him. Not in the obvious place that feelings live, but in the small precise places, the set of his shoulders, the line of his jaw, the way his hands were pressing down against the desk as though needing something solid. 12 years, she thought. He has trusted this man for 12 years. She didn't say anything about that. It wasn't the moment. "We need to go to the archive today," she said instead. "Now before anything else moves." "Yes," he said. "And we need to go without anyone knowing." "Yes." "Including Gregor and Pavel." He looked up at her. "You think—" "I don't know," Emma said. "I don't have evidence of anything except Dmitri. But if Dmitri is compromised and Baranov has been in your circle for 6 months, the only position that makes complete sense right now is to assume the circle is smaller than you thought until you know otherwise." His eyes were doing the thing again, moving and settling. "You and I," he said. "You and I," Emma confirmed. He straightened up. He reached into the desk drawer and removed a phone she hadn't seen before, different from the one he used in the office, prepaid functional, completely anonymous. "We leave in 20 minutes, he said. "From the service exit on Wacker. Tell no one." "I wasn't going to," Emma said. She stood. She picked up her bag. "Emma." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He looked at her across the office with that full, direct attention he used rarely and deliberately, and he said, "What you did this morning telling me about Dmitri, I know what it cost you to navigate that decision." Emma stood in the doorway. "Did it cost me anything?" "Trusting someone you've known 2 weeks over someone else's instruction," he said. "Yes, it cost you something." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been straight with me," she said. "Even when what you told me was complicated. Even when the truth didn't make you look clean." She paused. "That matters to me more than the length of time." He held her gaze. Then he nodded once. She went to get her coat. The archive was 40 minutes out of the city, and when Emma walked into the space where it was kept, she understood immediately why Natalia Petrova had built it the way she had. Not for what it looked like nothing. It looked like old storage, like the organized residue of a life that had been methodical and private, and not particularly dramatic. Folders, binders, filing boxes labeled in Russian in a handwriting that Emma recognized in her chest before she recognized it with her eyes. Her grandmother's handwriting. She stopped in the middle of the room. Alexander stood back. Emma reached out and touched the edge of a folder without opening it. Just the edge. Just the physical reality of something her grandmother had arranged, had organized with the specific disciplined care of a person who understood that the most important things in the world were the things nobody could see. She thought you hid this. You hid it, and you hid the key inside a granddaughter who didn't know she was carrying it, and you trusted that she'd find her way to the room eventually. She thought, "I'm here, babushka. I'm in the room." She opened the folder. For a moment, it was just paper. Just text in Russian, dense and administrative, the kind of document that made eyes slide off rather than engage. And then, it was like the moment in a song, when the melody you've been half hearing suddenly resolves into something clear and recognizable. Emma looked at the first page, and something in the architecture of it, the way the columns were arranged, the specific pattern of the cross-references, the rhythm of the notation system began to make a sound in her memory that was old and precise and completely familiar. Her grandmother's voice. Remember, Emochka. Groups of 5. Always 5. Then the connector word. Then 3. Then the main word. Always in that order, always. Emma looked at the page. She saw 5 things. A connector. 3 things. The main entry. She saw it. She could read it. She looked up at Alexander, who was watching her from across the room, with his hands still and his face doing the thing it did when he was waiting for something that mattered. "I can read it," she said. The room held the weight of that for a moment. "All of it," he said. Emma looked back at the page, then at the room full of folders. 60 years of her grandmother's architecture sitting here, waiting for the person who carried the key to walk through the door. "All of it," she said. And then from outside the building, she heard a car. Not Gregor, not Pavel. She looked at Alexander and saw that he heard it too, and that he had already moved to stand between her and the door, and that his hand was at his jacket in a way that meant the next 30 seconds were going to be something neither of them had planned for. She gripped the folder in her hand and stood her ground. If Viktor Malenkov had found them here, if the circle had been even smaller than either of them realized, if the leak ran deeper than Dmitri alone, then everything was about to happen much faster than they'd prepared for. The car outside stopped. A door opened, and Emma Collins, who had spent 25 years being ordinary, stood in a room full of her grandmother's secrets and did not step back. The door opened, and it was Dmitri. He came in alone, which was the first thing, and he came in with his hands visible, which was the second thing. And he came in with an expression on his face that Emma had never seen there before. Not the warmth, not the ease, not the constructed openness that had been his presentation since the morning he walked back into the office. What was on his face now was something stripped of all of that. Something that was just a man who had arrived at a moment he had been dreading for a long time and had finally run out of ways to avoid it. Alexander did not move his hand away from his jacket. "How did you find this location?" he said. Dmitri stopped just inside the door. "I've always known it," he said. "You thought it was compartmentalized. It wasn't. I'm sorry." He said the last 2 words the way people say things they mean absolutely and know are completely insufficient. "I'm sorry, Alex." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass to it. Emma felt it pressing against her sternum. "Are they coming?" Alexander said. "Not yet," Dmitri said. "I came ahead. I needed—" He stopped, looked at Emma, back at Alexander. "I needed to tell you myself, before it went any further." "Tell me what?" Alexander said. His voice was completely even. The evenness was the most frightening thing in the room. Dmitri looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "Viktor made contact 8 months ago, before Baranov, before any of this. He reached out through a channel I thought was clean, and by the time I understood who I was actually talking to, I had already said things." He exhaled. "Things I couldn't take back." "What things?" "Your movements, your meetings. Nothing operational at first. He said he only wanted to understand your position on certain historical matters. The Petrova connection." He paused. "I didn't know about the girl then. I didn't know she existed. I told him you'd been quietly researching the name and that you hadn't found anything conclusive." "And then I found her," Alexander said. "And then you found her," Dmitri confirmed. And Victor. He stopped again. He moved very fast when I told him. Faster than I expected. That was when I understood exactly what he wanted her for and what he was willing to do to get it, and He looked at Emma directly. I tried to get ahead of it. Asking you to come to me first if you were contacted. I thought I could control what reached him, slow it down, give Alex time. You were managing both sides, Emma said. I was trying to protect him, Dmitri said. The word him carrying more weight than the sentence around it. By feeding information to the man who wants to use me, Emma said. By slowing the information that reached him. There's a difference. He looked back at Alexander. Everything I told Victor after I understood what he was. Everything was calibrated. Old information, vague information. Things that looked useful but led nowhere. His voice had dropped to something rougher. I know that doesn't absolve it. I know what I did, but Alex, I swear to you, I was not going to let him. Stop, Alexander said. Dmitri stopped. Alexander's hand was no longer near his jacket. He had moved it to his side, which Emma registered, and understood meant something, though she wasn't sure yet what. He stood looking at Dmitri with an expression that was not rage. Rage would have been cleaner and easier to read. This was the face of a man processing a betrayal that had come from the specific direction where he had no defenses built because he had never imagined needing them there. How long? Alexander said, Do we have before Victor's people move on this location? Dmitri blinked. He had expected something else. He'd braced for something else. He doesn't know the location, he said. I never told him. That part was actually compartmentalized. You said you always knew it. Yes, and I never told him. His voice went to something plain and direct. That was the line, Alex. Whatever else I gave him, that was the line I didn't cross. Alexander was quiet. Emma watched him. She watched him do the thing she had spent 3 weeks learning to see: the internal calculation, the weighing of information against trust, against risk, against something that in a person with less discipline would simply be called feeling, and in him had no name she'd found yet. Victor's people are in the city, Emma said. To Dmitri. 6 of them confirmed. When does he make his move if you don't report back? Dmitri looked at her with what appeared to be genuine surprise, not at the question, but at who was asking it, at the quality of mind behind it. He'll expect contact within 4 hours, he said. If I don't make contact, he'll assume something went wrong and he'll accelerate, Emma said. Yes. So we have 4 hours, she said. She looked at Alexander. And Dmitri is the only channel to Victor that we currently control. Alexander's eyes moved to her slowly. He's not a liability, Emma said. Not anymore. He came here. He told you himself. That means we can use the channel. She held Alexander's gaze. If we use it correctly. The room held all 3 of them in its quiet for a moment. Dmitri looked between them. What are you thinking? He said. I'm thinking, Emma said, that Victor Malenkov has been operating on information for 8 months. Everything he knows through you, which means everything he thinks he knows we can now shape. She set her grandmother's folder down on the nearest surface and turned to face both of them fully. He thinks the archive is inaccessible. He thinks I might hold the key, but he doesn't know if that's true. He thinks Alexander is still running blind on the full scope of the Petrova connection. She paused. None of that is true anymore. But he doesn't know that. You want to use the intelligence gap? Alexander said. I want to use the 4 hours we have before it closes, Emma said. Dmitri contacts Victor and tells him the archive has been located and Alexander is moving to destroy it, tonight, that he's panicking because of the exposure to his father's name. She looked at Dmitri. Would Victor believe that? Dmitri thought for exactly 3 seconds. Yes, he said. Victor has always believed Alexander's primary motive is protecting his own family legacy. He'd believe a panic response. Then Victor moves fast, Emma said. He doesn't wait. He comes to stop the destruction of the archive himself, or he sends enough people to do it, and he comes to where Dmitri tells him the archive is being held. Not here, Alexander said. Not here. Emma agreed. Somewhere we choose. Somewhere we control. Alexander looked at her. He was doing it again, that full direct attention he rationed so carefully. And what happens when he gets there? He finds me, Emma said. The room went absolutely still. No, Alexander said. The word came out immediately and without the usual processing. Just the word, direct and flat, and carrying something that had nothing to do with strategy. Listen to me, Emma said. I said no. Alexander? She kept her voice level. He's going to come for me regardless. The question is whether he finds me on his terms or mine. If we choose the location, if we control who else is there, if I go in knowing exactly what he wants and what I carry. You are not bait, he said. I'm not bait, she said. I'm the reason he comes. There's a difference. She held his gaze without looking away. You said it yourself. His belief is more dangerous than the truth. He believes I can decode the archive. He's been building toward this for years. If I walk into a room with him, I can confirm his belief in a way that gives us something. What does it give us? Dmitri said. His terms, Emma said. What he actually wants. What he's planning to do with the archive once he has it. Who else is involved? She paused. 60 years of her archive and the names in it are only dangerous if someone uses them. I need to know how he plans to use them. Because if we move against him without knowing that we stop one man and leave the structure intact. Alexander was looking at her with that expression she couldn't decode. The one that was the territory just before feeling. She's right, Dmitri said quietly. I'm not asking for your assessment right now, Alexander said without looking at him. I know, Dmitri said. I'm giving it anyway because it's accurate. He paused. She's right, Alex. Victor doesn't work alone. He never has. Whatever he's building with the archive is connected upward and outward, and if you take him out without pulling the thread, you've cut a branch, not the root. Alexander stood very still for a long moment. Emma waited. She had learned to wait for him to give his silences their full duration, rather than rushing into them, and she did it now, even though something in her chest was doing something urgent and insistent that wanted him to agree before he'd finished thinking. What do you need? He said finally. She exhaled. Just slightly. 2 hours to go through enough of the archive to know what I'm walking in with. A location we control completely. And your people on the outside, not Gregor and Pavel people Victor doesn't know to account for. She paused. And Dmitri makes the call to Victor in exactly... She looked at her watch. 2 hours and 40 minutes. Alexander looked at Dmitri. Dmitri met his gaze. I'll make the call, he said. Whatever you need me to say. A pause. Long enough to carry the weight of 12 years in it. We'll talk about the rest later, Alexander said. You and I. Yes, Dmitri said. I know. Emma spent the next 2 hours at her grandmother's archive, and it was the most extraordinary 2 hours of her life. Not because of what she found, though. What she found was enough to dismantle the reputations of 14 men across 2 countries, and implicate 3 individuals who currently held positions of law enforcement authority at the federal level. Not because of that. Because of her grandmother. Because every page she turned was her grandmother's mind made visible. The architecture of it, the specific way Natalia Petrova had organized information, categorized it, cross-referenced it, was so perfectly mirrored by the patterns Emma had been given in that childhood game that reading it felt less like decryption and more like recognition. Like walking through a house you grew up in with the lights finally on. She thought you were brilliant. You were so careful and so brilliant, and you trusted me with the most important thing you ever made, and I didn't know, and I carried it all this time without knowing. And here I am. She found her grandmother's name in the archive, in several places, always as a notation rather than a participant, the mark of an archivist rather than an actor. Always precise, always invisible in exactly the way it was meant to be. She found Grigory Malenkov's name, Victor's father, and she found in the entries from the final 2 years before her grandmother had left Russia, a pattern that the archive had been designed to document. and that her grandmother had documented with the specific, deliberate care of someone who understood that this was the most important thing she would ever record. Grigory Malenkov had not built what he'd built for himself. He had been building it for a network of interests that extended well above him, men whose names were connected to governmental structures, to international financial institutions, to the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself because it had been built into the infrastructure beneath everything else. Men who had used Grigory as their instrument, and who, when Grigory died, had transferred their interest to Victor, and who were currently, according to documentation that ended 60 years ago, but whose patterns Emma could extrapolate forward with frightening clarity, almost certainly still operating. She put the folder down and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and just breathed. Alexander was at the far end of the room. He had not rushed her or spoken while she worked. She looked up and found him watching her, and she thought he understood this would be what it was. He knew before we came here that it wasn't just a piece of paper. He knew it was her grandmother's life, and he gave her the 2 hours without filling them. "How bad is it?" he said. "It's not Malenkov we need to worry about," Emma said. "Victor is the collection mechanism. What he's trying to get his hands on is valuable, not because he wants to use the archive himself, but because the people above him want him to bring it to them. People who are very motivated to know what's in it, and very motivated to make sure that what's in it never becomes public." Alexander was quiet. "Your father's name," Emma said. "He's in there. Not prominently. He was a secondary figure in one transaction set in the early 1980s. He was 23 years old, and I think he may not have fully understood what he was participating in." She met Alexander's eyes. "I think that's why your grandmother. Why my grandmother protected those records rather than destroying them. Because the truth in there is complicated. It's not only condemnation." Alexander stood very still. "She was precise," Emma said. "She recorded exactly what happened and nothing more. Your father is in there for what he did, which was limited and early. But the men above Grigory are in there for everything." She paused. "Everything Alexander. 40 years of it." He sat down. It was the first time she had ever seen him simply sit down, not taking a chair as a strategic position, not placing himself with deliberate economy of movement, but just sitting under the weight of what she'd said. "She kept it accurate," he said. "Yes," Emma said. "That's what she kept, the accuracy." He looked at his hands. Emma gave that the moment it needed. Then, "We need to decide. Victor is coming for the archive because the people above him want it. If we hand him something, a controlled piece of it, something that appears to be what he's looking for, we can find out who he's delivering to. And if we know who he's delivering to, we have the root," Alexander said. "We have the root," Emma said. Dmitri appeared at the edge of the room. 30 minutes, he said. Alexander looked up. He looked at Emma. The question on his face was not about strategy. "I'm ready," she said. The location they chose was a building Alexander controlled in the West Loop, a property held through a series of corporate structures that Victor's research would find if he looked, which he would, which was why they chose it. It needed to look like the kind of place Alexander would run to in a panic. It needed to be somewhere that made sense. Dmitri's call to Victor lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Emma stood nearby and listened and watched Dmitri perform the version of himself that had been feeding information for 8 months, the warm, reliable, slightly breathless voice of a man delivering urgent intelligence. He told Victor that Alexander had discovered the full scope of his father's involvement and had gone to the archive in a panic, that he was planning to destroy the records tonight, that Emma Collins was with him and appeared to have accessed at least part of the archive's contents. Victor's response, which Emma could hear partially through the phone, was fast and clipped and certain. He was coming. He would be there in 2 hours. He would come himself. Dmitri hung up and looked at Alexander. "He's bringing 4 people. He left 2 behind, I don't know where." "The 2 we haven't confirmed," Emma said. "Yes." Alexander made 2 calls on the prepaid phone. Short, specific coordinates and timing. Emma didn't know the people he called and didn't ask. She trusted the calls the way she'd learned to trust his decisions, not blindly, but based on evidence. He hadn't been wrong yet in any way that mattered. Emma. Alexander turned to her after the second call. Once Victor is in the room, you need to control the conversation. He will not expect you to be confident. He expects a frightened woman who has been dragged into something she doesn't understand. I know, she said. He'll try to establish dominance early. He'll use your grandmother's name as leverage. He'll suggest that what you carry belongs to him by right of inheritance. It doesn't, Emma said. No, Alexander said. It doesn't. He paused. But he believes it does, and that belief will make him careless. He looked at her with that direct attention. Let him be careless. Don't correct him until you have what we need. Emma nodded. And Emma. His voice dropped slightly. The moment you have it, the moment he names them names, the people above him gives us the chain, you step back. Whatever happens after that point, you step back and let me handle it. She looked at him. And if I can't, step back, he said again, not as an order, as something closer to a request which from him carried more weight. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. His jaw moved slightly. The smallest release of something. Doug. Viktor Malenkov arrived in 1 hour and 53 minutes, which meant he had been closer than 2 hours away when Dmitri made the call, which meant he had already been moving before the call came in, which meant he had another source. Emma processed this in the 3 seconds between hearing the cars outside and the door opening, and she had rearranged her understanding of the room by the time Victor walked through it. He was not what she'd constructed from his name and his history and the weight he'd carried in other people's conversations. He was in his 60s, compact and well-dressed, with the particular grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of communication. He had silver at his temples and a face that had been handsome once and was now just authoritative, the handsomeness having ceded to something harder over decades of use. He saw Emma immediately. He looked at her the way she'd been looked at by powerful men before the assessment. The categorization, the rapid filing of a person into a box. Then something shifted in his look. Because she wasn't in the box he'd prepared. She was standing in the middle of the room beside Alexander, and she was not frightened, and she was not behind him, and she was holding a folder from her grandmother's archive with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 2 hours reading it and understood exactly what she was holding. Miss Collins, he said, in English, smooth and measured. Mr. Malenkov, Emma said. In Russian. Completely natural. Her grandmother's Russian, the kind that didn't announce itself. Something moved across his face. You know who I am, he said, switching to Russian. I know who your father was, Emma said. And I know what my grandmother built for him. And I know you've been looking for it since he died. She paused. I've been looking at it for 2 hours. Victor's eyes moved to the folder in her hands. Can you read it? He said. Fast. The first uncontrolled thing he'd said. Yes, Emma said. He looked at Alexander. Something hostile moved through his expression. This doesn't involve you, he said. She involves me, Alexander said. She belongs, Victor started. Say that carefully, Alexander said. Victor stopped. He looked between them. He was calculating she could see it the same way she could see calculations running in any room she'd spent enough time in. He was counting his 4 people against Alexander's position, and whatever support was outside, and he was deciding whether the mathematics worked. You came here because you want the archive, Emma said, pulling his attention back to her. I understand that. I also understand why. The people above your father, the ones he built this for, they want what's in here, and you've been their instrument the same way your father was. She held his gaze. Tell me their names. Silence. I came here to retrieve property that belongs. Tell me their names, Emma said again. Even, calm. And I will tell you what I read in 2 hours that your people have been trying to decode for 60 years. Victor looked at her. She could feel Alexander to her right absolutely still. You'd trade, Victor said. I'd consider it, Emma said. Victor was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her differently now. Not with the earlier assessment which had been dismissive, but with something that was closer to the attention she received in meetings when she translated a sentence, and the room suddenly understood something it hadn't understood before. He was recalibrating. "Sit down, Miss Collins," he said. "I'm fine standing," she said. Another recalibration, smaller. "The people I work for," he said, "are not names you would recognize." "Try me," Emma said. He smiled. It didn't reach any part of his face that mattered. "Names are the least of what they have. Naming them to you accomplishes nothing except making you dangerous." "I'm already dangerous," Emma said. "I have 2 hours of your grandfather's archive in my head, and I can read every page of it. I was dangerous the moment I picked up the phone in that diner and spoke Russian to your colleague." She paused. "You've known about me since before I was born, Mr. Malenkov. That means you've been afraid of me since before I was born. The only question is whether you're smart enough to make that fear useful." Victor stared at her. She saw it happen, the thing that happened in negotiation rooms, when the balance shifted, the almost invisible moment when one person understood that the map they'd walked in with didn't match the territory they were standing in. Victor Malenkov had come here for an archive and a frightened woman, and he had found the archive in her hands, and no fear anywhere in the room. "Konevsky," he said, quiet, almost to himself. Emma did not react. "Brennan," he said, slightly louder now, watching her. "And Sorokin, those are 3 of the 7. He paused. "You won't find them in that folder. They came after. They built on what my father created after your grandmother left, and they have been the reason that archive has never been safe to surface." His voice changed, went to something flatter and more honest. "They will not stop. Not for me. Not for you. Not for Volkov. If the contents of that archive become public, they will remove every person who had access to it." "Including you," Emma said. "Including me," he said. The room was very quiet. "Then we have the same problem," Emma said. Victor looked at her for a long moment. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Emma said, "that the archive in my head is more useful to everyone as a guarantee than as a document." She paused. "As long as I can read it, no one can destroy it. And as long as no one can destroy it, the people whose names are in it have a reason to make sure I remain intact." She let that land. "You came here to take the key from me. I'm offering you a different arrangement. One where having me alive and unharmed is in everyone's interest, including Konevsky's and Brennan's and Sorokin's." Victor was very still. "You want to be untouchable," he said. "I want to be unnecessary to harm," Emma said. "That's different." Silence. "And in exchange," Victor said slowly. "In exchange," Emma said, "the archive stays unread. The information stays protected. The people in it, including your father's name and the entries that show you were not aware of what you were inheriting when you were young enough that awareness wasn't reasonable, those entries remain private." She paused. "Unless someone makes a move against Alexander, or against me, or against anyone connected to us." The silence this time was the longest one. Victor looked at Alexander. "You'd accept this?" "She's speaking for both of us," Alexander said. Victor's eyes came back to Emma. She held his gaze and felt her heartbeat doing something significant in her chest, and kept all of it exactly where it was. Internal and invisible, the way her grandmother had taught her, not with lessons, but with years of watching a woman carry enormous things without letting them show on her face. "The 7 names," Victor said. "You want all of them." "I want enough to make the guarantee work," Emma said. "Konevsky, Brennan, Sorokin. 4 more." Victor looked at the folder in her hands, then at her face, then at something interior that she couldn't see but could feel him consulting some version of his own calculation, his own accounting of what this moment cost against what the alternative cost. He gave her 4 more names. She did not write them down. She held them in the part of her memory that had been holding her grandmother's sequences for 20 years, and they settled there with the same permanence, and she knew they would still be there in 40 years if she needed them. "We have an arrangement," she said. Victor stood. He looked older than when he'd come in, which was something that happened to people when they put down something heavy they'd been carrying for a long time. "Your grandmother," he said. He was speaking in Russian quietly. "She would have done the same thing, made the same offer." "I know," Emma said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he left. His 4 people filed out behind him. The room held the sound of cars receding. Emma stood in the silence and felt her legs decide they were done with whatever they'd been doing, and she took 2 steps to the nearest chair and sat down. Alexander crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched in front of her. He put his hands on the arms of the chair, not touching her, just present, and looked at her face. "Are you?" "I'm fine," she said. "Give me 10 seconds." He gave her 10 seconds. She looked at him. His face was doing the thing it did, but closer now, more visible in its effort. The thing that lived underneath the discipline. "7 names," he said. "7 names," she said. "And you remember all of them. Every one." He exhaled, short and deliberate, the breath of a man releasing something that had been held too long. "Your grandmother," he said quietly. "She built something extraordinary." "Yes," Emma said. "She did." She looked at him. "And so did I." Just now, his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the territory where a smile would be if Alexander Volkov allowed himself to reach for one. "Yes," he said. "You did." His hands were still on the arms of the chair just beside hers. Neither of them moved. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Running urgent, indifferent to the weight of what had just happened in this room. And inside, something settled into place in the space between 2 people who had spent 3 weeks learning each other across conference tables and encrypted phones and rooms full of dangerous information. Something that didn't have a name yet. But it was there. Both of them knew it was there, and neither of them said so because neither of them needed to yet. Emma sat in the chair in her grandmother's archive and held 7 names and 60 years of hidden truth in the part of her mind that never forgot anything, and she thought, "I found the room, babushka. I found the room, and I didn't step back. I didn't step back." The arrangement held for 11 days. 11 days of quiet that felt less like peace and more like the specific silence that exists between a struck bell and its echo, everything vibrating at a frequency you could feel in your back teeth, but couldn't quite hear yet. Emma went back to the office on LaSalle Street. She sat in meetings. She translated. She watched Alexander move through his days with the same controlled precision he'd always had, except now she could read the additional layer underneath it, the layer that was monitoring 7 names across 2 continents and calculating what each day of silence meant. On the 12th day, Brennan moved. Not against them, against Victor. The call came in at 6:40 in the morning, and Emma was already awake because she had developed in the past 3 weeks a relationship with sleep that was cordial but not close. She was in her kitchen with tea when her phone rang, and it was Alexander's direct number, the one that meant, "Don't wait, answer immediately." "Brennan's people picked up Victor last night," he said. "No preamble. He's not reachable." Emma set down her tea. "They found out about our meeting." "They found out about his cooperation," Alexander said. "There's a difference." There was. The difference was that Brennan and the others had not been alarmed by Victor's meeting with Emma. They had been alarmed by what Victor had told her, which meant they knew what he'd told her, which meant the arrangement she'd made, the mutual guarantee of silence in exchange for safety, had been understood by the people at the top of the structure within 11 days, and their response had been to remove Victor. "They're sending a message," Emma said. "Yes. To us. To you specifically," Alexander said. Victor was the message. The content of the message is, we are not bound by what he agreed to. Emma stood in her kitchen and felt the morning shift around her, the particular quality of an ordinary moment revealing itself as something else entirely. Tea cooling in a mug. The Chicago skyline through her window doing its daily thing indifferent and magnificent. And somewhere in the structure of power that ran underneath the visible city, 7 names she'd memorized in a room full of her grandmother's files were deciding what to do about her existence. "How long do we have?" she said. "I don't know," Alexander said. "But I don't think we measure it in weeks." "Where are you?" "On my way to you," he said. "Don't leave the building." He arrived in 14 minutes, which told her something about where he'd been when he called. He came up to her apartment for the first time. She buzzed him in and unlocked the door, and he came through it with Gregor behind him, and the look of a man who had been thinking hard since before sunrise. He stopped just inside the door and looked at her kitchen. The tea. The photograph of her grandmother on the refrigerator. The general evidence of an ordinary life that was only ordinary in its physical details and had not been ordinary in any meaningful sense for the past month. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking we miscalculated," Emma said. "Not about Victor, about the people above him. I thought the guarantee worked both ways. If they knew I carried the archive in my head, they'd have a reason to leave me intact. But the guarantee only works if their primary fear is exposure." She paused. "What if their primary fear is something else?" Alexander looked at her. "Say it. What if they're not afraid of what's in the archive?" Emma said. "What if they've already burned everything that archive could expose? 40 years is a long time. The men named in those records have had decades to restructure, relocate, rebuild. The financial evidence is old. The jurisdictions have changed. Some of the co-signatories are dead." She felt her way through the logic as she spoke. The archive was devastating 60 years ago. Today it might be embarrassing, but manageable. If Konevsky and Brennan and the others have spent 40 years making themselves legally untouchable, then the archive is not a weapon, Alexander said quietly. "It's a symbol." "And symbols," Emma said, "you can afford to destroy." The room held that. Gregor by the door said nothing. He was good at being in rooms without adding himself to them. Alexander sat down at Emma's kitchen table, which was not something she'd anticipated. Alexander Volkov sitting at her small kitchen table with its worn surface and its ring stains from 10,000 mugs of tea, and he put his hands flat on it and looked at them. "Then we need to change what the archive is," he said. Emma looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Right now the archive is leverage," he said. "A threat held in your memory that only works if they believe we'll use it. If they've concluded we won't, or that the cost of its use is manageable, the leverage is gone." He looked up at her. "We need to make it real. We need to make it public." Emma felt something cold move through her. "If we make it public, they lose the motive to silence you," he said. "If the archive is already out, if the names are already known, killing you accomplishes nothing. You become a witness, not a vault. Witnesses are harder to justify removing." "Witnesses also testify," Emma said. "And testifying requires law enforcement that isn't named in those records." "Konevsky," Alexander said. "Sorokin," Emma countered. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "Not all of them," Emma said. 3 names out of 7 are law enforcement or adjacent. That leaves 4. And there are agencies those 4 don't touch." She was working through it now, her mind moving the way it moved in meetings fast, lateral tracking multiple conversations at once. "If we choose the right channel, if we go to the right person before Brennan's people understand what we're doing, we have to move today," Alexander said. "Yes, today, Emma. Not tomorrow, not tonight. We move in the next 6 hours or we don't move at all." She looked at her grandmother's photograph on the refrigerator. Natalia Petrova Collins' hands folded, eyes private, carrying everything she carried and showing none of it. "I know someone," Emma said. Alexander waited. "A journalist," she said. "Someone who covered international financial crime for 15 years before she moved to teaching. She's not connected to any of the agencies. She's not on anyone's radar because she stepped back from active reporting 8 years ago." Emma pulled her phone off the counter. She's also the person who wrote the definitive piece on financial structures in the former Soviet states in 2009. She knows this world. She'll understand what she's looking at. Can you trust her? I can trust her more than anyone named Sorokin, Emma said. Alexander almost smiled. The almost was so brief she nearly missed it. Call her, he said. Her name was Margaret Osei, and she had been Emma's professor for one semester in a continuing education course on investigative journalism that Emma had taken 3 years ago on a whim and had never fully explained to herself why. She answered on the third ring, and Emma could hear in her voice the particular alertness of a person who woke up already thinking. Emma Collins, Margaret said. It's been a while. I know, Emma said. I'm sorry to call early. It's not early for me. What's going on? You sound different. I am different, Emma said. Margaret, I need to meet with you today, in the next few hours. I have something I need to show you, and I need you to listen to all of it before you decide anything. A pause. What kind of something? The kind that's going to sound impossible for the first 10 minutes and then become very clear, Emma said. I need you to trust me for those 10 minutes. Another pause. Longer. Where? Somewhere public, Emma said. Somewhere neither of us picked in advance. You choose. A beat. The reading room at the Harold Washington Library. Noon. 3rd floor. We'll be there, Emma said. She hung up and looked at Alexander. Noon. He nodded. He was already on the prepaid phone making arrangements she didn't ask about. She went to her bedroom and changed clothes with the specific focus of someone who is not thinking about what they're putting on, because their mind is entirely elsewhere, and came back out, and they left her apartment together, and she didn't look back at the photograph on the refrigerator as she pulled the door closed. She didn't need to. She carried it the same place she carried everything her grandmother had given her. Chai. The 3 hours between the call and noon were the longest 3 hours Emma had spent since the morning after she'd answered the phone at Rosario's. She and Alexander did not go back to the LaSalle office. They moved with Gregor cycling routes at intervals that Emma understood were anti-surveillance patterns without needing it explained, and Alexander made calls and received them and gave nothing away. In his voice, regardless of what the calls contained, and Emma sat with the 7 names in her memory and the architecture of her grandmother's system, and thought about how to present 60 years of hidden truth to a woman she'd known for one semester in a way that was coherent and credible, and not completely terrifying. She also thought about what Alexander had said in her kitchen, not the strategy. The moment before the strategy, when he'd walked through her door and stopped and looked at her apartment, at the tea and the photograph and the worn table, and something in his face had done what it did when it was working against itself. The control and the thing that the control was containing, both visible at once, for just a second, before he'd pulled it back. She thought about that and filed it in the same place she'd been filing everything she couldn't address yet. At 11:45, they entered the Harold Washington Library from different directions and met on the 3rd floor, and Margaret Osei was already there, seated at a reading table near the back, with a cup of coffee and the particular patient expression of a woman who had spent 30 years listening to people tell her things they'd never told anyone else. She was in her early 60s, compact and precise, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that assessed quickly and concluded carefully. She looked at Emma, and then at Alexander, and then back at Emma. "Who is he?" she said, directly. "Someone with a stake in what I'm about to tell you," Emma said, "and resources we're going to need." Margaret looked at Alexander for a moment longer. "You're Volkov," she said. Not a question. Something shifted in Alexander's face. "You know me. I know your name," Margaret said. "From the 2009 piece I did. A peripheral reference. I didn't follow up on it at the time." She looked at Emma. "Now I'm wondering if I should have." "Everything you didn't follow up on in 2009, Emma said, "is about to sit down across from you." Margaret picked up her coffee. "Start talking," she said. Emma talked for 40 minutes without stopping. She told Margaret everything. Not everything she held the 7 names until the right moment, but everything else. Her grandmother. The archive. The summer game that had been a key. Alexander's father mentioned precisely and in context. Baranov. Dmitri. Victor. The meeting in the archive room. The arrangement that had held for 11 days and broken this morning. Margaret listened. The way great listeners listen without interruption, without visible reaction, with the complete focused attention of someone who is sorting information in real time and building a structure from it as it arrives. When Emma finished, Margaret was quiet for exactly 30 seconds. Then she said, "The archive itself. Physical records." "Yes," Emma said. "And your ability to read it is based on a mnemonic system my grandmother encoded in a language exercise she gave me as a child," Emma said. "I know how it sounds." "It sounds like the most sophisticated information protection system I've ever heard of," Margaret said. "That's how it sounds." She set down her coffee. "The names." 7, Emma said. 3 with direct law enforcement connections, 4 without. She paused. "I'll give you all 7, but I need something from you first." "What?" "I need to know you can move on this fast enough that publishing precedes their response to publishing," Emma said. "Not a story next month. Not a story next week. I need to know the infrastructure exists to get this verified and out before Brennan's people connect what we're doing to what we're doing." Margaret looked at her steadily. "You're asking me to publish unverified information under a deadline driven by your personal safety timeline." "No," Emma said. "I'm asking you to verify it faster than you normally would because you have access to the archive and to me and to someone," she glanced at Alexander, "who can provide corroborating financial documentation for the transactions named in the records." She paused. "How long do you actually need?" Margaret thought. Really thought the kind of thinking that looked like stillness but was moving fast underneath. 48 hours, she said. "If what you're saying about the archive is accurate and the corroboration is as solid as you're suggesting, 48 hours to verify the core claims and bring in 2 other journalists I trust at outlets that will publish simultaneously." "Simultaneously is important," Alexander said. It was the first time he'd spoken in 40 minutes, and Margaret looked at him with recalibrated attention. "Yes," he said. "Simultaneous publication across multiple outlets means no single source can be suppressed before the story propagates. It means legal pressure lands in too many places at once to be effectively applied." His voice was even and precise. "I assume you've done this before." "Once," Margaret said. "In 2014. It worked." She looked at Emma. "The names." Emma gave her all 7. She watched Margaret write them and watched her face when she wrote the 3rd one and the 6th one. The specific quality of recognition, the controlled response of someone who has just confirmed a long-held suspicion and is deciding what to do with the confirmation. "The 6th name," Margaret said quietly. "Yes," Emma said. "He's been untouchable for 20 years, Margaret said. "He put a lot of work into being that way," Emma said. "My grandmother put more work into documenting what he was before he was untouchable." Margaret looked at the list. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked up. "I need you both somewhere safe for 48 hours. Somewhere off any grid I know about." She looked at Alexander. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Alexander said. "And I need access to the archive. Physical access today with a documentation team I trust." "I'll arrange it," Alexander said. Margaret closed her notebook. "Emma." Her voice went somewhere quieter and more direct. "What you're doing, you understand the nature of it." "Yes," Emma said. "Once this publishes, the leverage inverts completely. You become a source rather than a vault, and sources need protection," Emma said. "I know. Long-term protection, institutional protection, not just—" She glanced at Alexander. "I know," Emma said again. "I've thought about it." Margaret held her gaze for a moment. "Your grandmother," she said. "She built something remarkable." She did, Emma said, and she trusted me to know what to do with it when the time came. She paused. I think this is the time. The 48 hours were the strangest of Emma's life, which was a high bar given the preceding month. Alexander took them to a property she'd never known about, not the archive location, somewhere different. A place that existed in no documentation connected to his name, and it was quiet in the way that places are quiet when the people in them are waiting for something enormous and moving very fast to arrive. Margaret's team went to the archive. Emma spoke with them by phone for 4 hours on the first day, walking them through the reading system, translating the categories, explaining the cross-reference structure her grandmother had built. She heard in their voices the same thing she'd felt when she'd first looked at those pages, the shock of a system suddenly resolving into clarity, 60 years of hidden information becoming legible all at once. On the first evening, Alexander made dinner. This was so unexpected that Emma stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, just absorbing it. Alexander Volkov in a kitchen cooking something that smelled like the specific combination of onion and bay leaf and black pepper that her grandmother had used in borscht. He didn't acknowledge her standing there. He just cooked. "Where did you learn?" she said finally. "My mother," he said. She believed that a man who couldn't feed himself was only half a person. He paused. I agreed with her. Emma sat down at the kitchen table and watched him, and thought about the version of this man she'd been afraid of on that first night, the reputation, the rumors, Diane's careful professional concern. She thought about the distance between the name Alexander Volkov and the person who stood in a kitchen making borscht, because his mother had thought it was important. "Your mother," she said. "She's 12 years gone," he said. "Yes." "I'm sorry." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you," he said, not looking at her, working at the stove. She had no patience for people who couldn't find their way through a hard thing. She would have thought you had a correct relationship with difficulty. Emma looked at him. "A correct relationship with difficulty," she repeated. "It means you don't run from it, and you don't pretend it isn't there," he said. "You just find out what it's made of, and then you make a decision." He brought 2 bowls to the table and sat across from her. She ate her grandmother's soup made by someone else's hands and thought about how strange and specific a thing life was, that it could bring you to a table like this, in a room like this, with a month like the one she'd had, and the soup could still taste exactly like it was supposed to. "Alexander," she said. He looked up. "When this is over," she said. "When the story publishes and whatever comes after it, I want to stay." She held his gaze. "Not because I don't have anywhere else to be. I have places to be. But I want to stay because this is where the work is, and this is where I'm useful, and this is—" She stopped. "Say it," he said. "This is where you are," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Alexander looked at her across the table with that full direct attention. He rationed carefully, and this time he didn't fold it back. He let it stay. "The contract is renewable," he said. "Every 6 months, with renegotiation rights." Emma felt something in her chest do something uncomplicated and warm. "That's a very formal way to respond to what I just said." "Yes," he said. "I'm aware." A pause. The edge of the thing that was not quite a smile. "I'll work on it." She laughed. Quietly, genuinely, the kind of laugh that has nothing performed about it. He watched her laugh, and something in his face moved that she had never seen there before. Not the almost smile, not the controlled attention. Something undefended. Something that had simply decided in this kitchen over this soup that it was done working so hard to stay hidden. She saw it and didn't say anything. Some things didn't need to be named immediately. Some things were better carried for a while, first held gently until they were sure of their own weight. She had learned that from her grandmother. Wow. The story published at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd day simultaneously across 4 outlets in 3 countries. Emma was awake when it happened. She was sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hand, and she watched the notifications come in. First one outlet, then the second. 40 seconds later, then the third and fourth in quick succession, Margaret's coordination precise and complete. She sat with the phone in her hand and felt the specific silence of a very large thing that has just been done and cannot be undone. She thought about her grandmother carrying the archive out of Russia in her head. She thought about 60 years of patience, 60 years of a system waiting for the person who could read it. She thought about a summer game that had felt like nothing and had been everything. She thought, I did it, babushka. I found the room and I read what you wrote and I didn't let them bury it. It's out now. It's out and it's everywhere, and they cannot take it back. Alexander appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed and looked at the phone in her hands, at the notifications still coming in, the story propagating across platforms and languages and time zones. It's done, she said. It's done, he confirmed. She leaned her shoulder against his and felt him not move away, which was the same as an embrace from a man who had spent 38 years building walls and was currently deciding shoulder by shoulder where the doors went. What happens now? She said. Now, he said, the lawyers come. Federal inquiries, depositions, international cooperation requests. It will take years, and it will be loud and complicated, and none of the 7 will go quietly. But they'll go, Emba said. Yes, he said, they'll go. And your father's name. A pause. Will be accurately represented in the coverage, he said. Early involvement, limited scope. He's been gone for 9 years, and the truth is, the truth. He was quiet for a moment. My grandmother, your grandmother, she recorded what happened, all of it, including the parts that were complicated. His shoulder pressed back slightly against hers. I think that's the most honest thing anyone has ever done for me. Emma looked at the phone and then set it face down on the bed, because the notifications were still coming, and she wanted one moment of quiet before the rest of it started. Margaret called last night, she said, after we spoke to the legal team. What did she say? She said the 6th name, the one that surprised her, had already retained 3 law firms before midnight. Emma paused. She said that's how you know you got it right. When they call the lawyers before they call anyone else. Alexander made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. Yes, he said. That's accurate. They sat together in the quiet for another moment. Then his phone started ringing. And hers. And from somewhere in the building, she could hear Gregor's voice in the low register that meant something was developing, and he was tracking it. Ready, Alexander said. Emma picked up her phone. I've been ready since the night I answered a phone that wasn't mine, she said. He looked at her. The thing on his face that had come out in the kitchen over soup was still there, not hiding, not working to stay hidden. Just present in the steady, undefended way of something that has decided to remain. I know, he said. I know you have. 3 months later, Emma Collins was no longer a waitress at Rosario's diner, and had not been for longer than that, but Janelle called on a Tuesday afternoon to tell her that the owner had framed the review that mentioned the restaurant's unusually excellent atmosphere for private conversation, and hung it by the front door, and they both laughed for a while about that. She was sitting in the office on the 8th floor of the building on LaSalle Street when the call came in. Not the conference room, not the private office with the desk that faced the door, but an office that had been arranged for her specifically in the months since everything had shifted, with a window that looked east, and a desk that faced wherever she wanted it to face, and shelves that were beginning to accumulate the kind of objects that accumulate when a person has decided somewhere is theirs. On one shelf was a photograph. Natalia Petrova Collins at her kitchen table, hands folded, eyes private. On the desk beside Emma's laptop was a small notebook, half filled with entries that were not translations, but were not entirely separate from translation either. Notes on language and pattern and the specific way that meaning lived underneath words, if you knew where to listen for it. She had started writing them 2 months ago, without entirely deciding to the way you start things that have been waiting for you to be ready for them. Her work had changed in shape since the story published, though not in nature. The legal proceedings had required a different kind of translation. Depositions. international cooperation documents, testimony that needed to be not just linguistically accurate, but contextually precise in a way that held up under the scrutiny of very expensive opposing counsel. She was good at it, better possibly than she had been at the meetings because the stakes were clearer and the room for error was smaller, and she worked best she had learned when the margin was exactly that tight. Pavel had told her last week that she was the best professional he'd worked with in 15 years. He had said it in Russian and then looked slightly embarrassed, which she had found unexpectedly endearing. Gregor had said nothing, which from Gregor she had learned to read as the highest available form of approval. Dmitri was not there. Dmitri had left the month before, by mutual agreement, an agreement that had taken Alexander 3 weeks to arrive at, and that Emma had not rushed and had not weighed in on, because it was not her 12 years, and not her history, and not her specific particular private grief to manage. She had simply been present in the ways she could be, and absent in the ways he needed. The morning Dmitri left the building for the last time, Alexander had come back up to the 8th floor and sat at the conference table for 20 minutes without speaking, and Emma had made tea and put it in front of him, and sat at the other end of the table and worked on her notes and said nothing. That was the morning she understood completely what they were to each other, not despite the complicated history and the dangerous month and the weight of everything that had happened in between. Because of it. Because the things that had built them both, her grandmother's hidden archive, his father's early mistakes, the slow, patient work of becoming trustworthy in a world that rewarded the opposite, had made them into people who knew, without needing it explained, how to be present for the specific kind of silence that mattered. He had looked at her over the untouched tea and said, "You didn't say anything." "No," she said. "You knew I didn't need it?" "Yes," she said. He had looked at her for a long moment with that full, direct attention, undefended present. "How did you know?" "I've been translating you for 3 months," Emma said. "I know what you mean even when you're not saying it." Something moved across his face. Something warm and certain that had no trace of the control left in it. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know you do." He had reached across the conference table and put his hand over hers. That was all. Just his hand over hers in the morning quiet of an 8th floor office in Chicago, with the legal proceedings happening in 4 jurisdictions, and the world doing its complicated, indifferent, continuous thing outside the window. She had turned her hand over and held his. On a Thursday evening in November, 4 months after the night Emma Collins had answered a stranger's phone in a diner on the north side of Chicago, she and Alexander stood at the window of the 8th floor and watched the city doing what it always did. "Pavel thinks you should have an official title," Alexander said. "I have a title," Emma said. "It's on the employment contract." "He thinks it undersells what you actually do." "What does he suggest?" "He used the phrase operational intelligence architect," Alexander said. "I told him that was 3 words too long." "It's also not entirely accurate," Emma said. "I don't architect anything. I read what's already there." "That is," Alexander said, "an extraordinarily modest description of what you do." Emma looked at the river far below, dark and moving. "My grandmother never had a title," she said. "She was just the person who understood the system well enough to build it." "Yes," Alexander said. "And no one saw her coming." Emma thought about that. About the quality of invisibility her grandmother had cultivated, not the invisibility of smallness, but the invisibility of precision, of being exactly what you were, and nothing more, in a way that made the people who underestimated you entirely responsible for their own mistake. "They saw me coming," Emma said. "Eventually," Alexander said, "when it was too late to matter." She looked at him. He was looking at the city, and in profile, the discipline was visible, but so was the thing underneath it, the thing that had been there since the kitchen and the soup and the shoulder on the bed in the quiet, before the notifications arrived. It lived on his face now with the ease of something that had stopped working to hide. "Alexander," she said. He turned. She looked at him with all of it present. 3 months of conference tables and legal proceedings and dinners that turned into long conversations about things that had nothing to do with work, and everything to do with what they were becoming to each other. All of it in her face unhidden, because she had not inherited her grandmother's patience for carrying things indefinitely without putting them down. "I love you," she said. Simply, without preamble or construction. The city did its thing behind them. Alexander looked at her face with everything in it. At the woman who had answered a phone she shouldn't have answered, and spoken a language she'd been given as a child, and walked into room after room where she had no business being, and had been exactly right every time about what she was hearing and what it meant. He took her face in his hands. He was careful with it, the way he was careful with everything that mattered to him, which was not the care of timidity, but the care of someone who understands the value of a thing, precisely because they have not always had things worth being careful with. "I know," he said. His voice was low and certain, and had nothing managed about it. "I have been working up to saying it since the night I came back to that diner, and you looked at me like I was a person and not a name." "You are a person," Emma said. "I know that now," he said. "You made that extremely difficult to argue with." She laughed. He kissed her. The city went on, being the city indifferent magnificent, doing its relentless running thing in every direction at once. When they finally stepped back from the window, Emma looked once more at the river below and thought about her grandmother. About a young woman who had left Russia with a system built into her memory and a secret held in perfect silence for 60 years. Who had sat in a kitchen teaching her granddaughter a language that was not only a language. Who had trusted that the right moment would come, and the right person would be ready, and the door would open from the right direction at the right time. "Emma thought you were right, babushka. You were right about all of it. She thought I found the room. I read the archive. I said the names. And I didn't do it alone." She turned from the window and went back to her desk, and Alexander went back to his calls and the office on LaSalle Street, held them both in its quiet, ordinary, entirely extraordinary evening, and outside the city moved with the patient insistence of something that had always known this was where the story was going. Emma Collins had spent 25 years being ordinary. She had spent 1 month learning what she was made of. And she had spent every day since proving that the most dangerous thing in any room is not the person with the most power. It is the person who understands with complete and unshakable clarity exactly what they carry and exactly what it is worth.